Hey guys, tonight we're slipping below decks into the middle of the night on a pirate sloop somewhere in the Bahamian shallows in the summer of 1718, and we are not going to have an easy night of it. Because somewhere up above you, on a deck you can't see, a lookout has just called out a sail, feet are hammering across planking 6 inches over your head. And the men lying in the dark beside you are trying to work out whether tonight ends with a bag of Spanish silver or a rope around the neck. There will be cut anchor cables, muffled oars, a governor with a king's pardon in one hand and a hangman's warrant in the other, and one 40-gun frigate that spent the back half of 1718 hunting exactly this kind of ship through exactly these waters. Welcome to the Pirate Night Chase, 1718, the year the so-called Golden Age of Piracy started running out of places to hide. Before we cast off, get yourself set for the night. Dim the lights if you haven't already, and if you've got a fan or a white noise machine nearby, let it hum low and steady, like wind moving through rigging on a warm night. You're warm right now. You're dry. Nobody outside your window is counting the guns on your roof and deciding whether you're worth the risk of a fight. That won't be true for the men we're about to spend the night with. So get comfortable. Let your shoulders go heavy, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, down through the hatch, into the dark, crowded, salt-thick air below a pirate ship's deck, in the last calm minute before somebody starts shouting. It is somewhere past 9 at night, and you are, for the moment, comfortable. Comfortable is a strong word for it, but by the standards of 1718, it will do. The smell hits you before anything else does, tar and bilge water, and the particular sourness of 40 men who haven't properly washed in 3 weeks. Laid over the top of salt pork boiling somewhere forward, and the sweet rot of a barrel of water that should have been changed a fortnight ago. You've stopped noticing most of it. That's not a mercy, that's just what your nose does after enough exposure, and it's one of the smaller tragedies of shipboard life that nobody puts in the songs. You're lying in a hammock slung between 2 deck beams, canvas warm from your own body heat, swinging gently with the small motion of the hull at anchor. The overhead planking is close enough that if you sat up too fast you'd crack your skull on a beam. Most sloops of this size gave you somewhere between 4.5 and 5 feet of headroom between decks, which is fine if you're lying down and miserable if you're not. Here's the thing nobody tells you about pirate ships. Sleeping below decks wasn't a comfort. It was a last resort. Given the choice, a lot of men slept up on the open deck instead, on a folded sail or a coiled cable, because at least up there you could breathe. Tonight you drew the short straw, or maybe you didn't draw anything at all. Maybe you're new enough aboard that nobody bothered asking your preference. Beside you, close enough that his elbow occasionally finds your ribs when the ship rolls, is a man named Josiah Barlow, and he is, in the strict legal sense, not supposed to be here. Barlow was a sailmaker's mate on a Bristol snow bound for Kingston 2 months back. A decent hand with a fid and a palm and needle, and when this crew took his ship as a prize somewhere off the Windward Passage, the quartermaster looked at his hands, rope-calloused, sailmaker's hands, and decided the crew had a use for him. That's forcing, and it was common enough that admiralty courts in this era developed whole procedures for sorting out which captured men had joined pirate crews willingly, and which ones hadn't had a real choice in the matter. Barlow didn't have a real choice. He has, in the 6 weeks since, developed a habit of running his thumbnail along the seam of whatever canvas is nearest him, checking the stitching without meaning to, like a man who can't stop doing the job even when the job stopped being his idea. You've noticed it. Everyone on this deck has noticed something small about everyone else, because on a ship this size there is nowhere to hide your habits. That's the other thing about tonight's comfort. It's borrowed and it's crowded. A merchant vessel this size, maybe 70 or 80 tons, would ordinarily carry 10 or 15 men. This one is carrying somewhere close to 80, packed into a hull built for a fraction of that number, because a pirate crew's entire military strategy was to have more hands than anyone expected. More hands to board with, more hands to work the guns, more hands to intimidate a merchant captain into striking his colours before a shot was even fired. Congratulations, you're one of 80 people trying to sleep in a space that was designed on its best day for 15. The bad news is that this is also why the air down here is doing what it's doing to your lungs right now. There is no joke that makes crowding on this scale comfortable, so we won't try to make one. Some things just sit there, and you just breathe through them. And that's what you're doing right now, one slow breath at a time, waiting for sleep that hasn't quite arrived yet. Somewhere close to your feet, a rat runs the length of a deck beam with the unhurried confidence of an animal that has never once been successfully hunted down here. You've stopped flinching at that too. Ships of this era were, without much exaggeration, floating rat colonies. A well-provisioned vessel could host populations in the hundreds, living in the bilge, in the hold. In the gaps behind the ceiling planking, eating through the ship's biscuit and occasionally, if the accounts are to be believed, through a sleeping man's fingertips if he didn't tuck them in. The ship's cat, if there is one, is currently 3 decks away pursuing a more promising lead. Here's what nobody warns you about pirate life before you sign the articles. It isn't the cannon fire that gets you first. It's the rats, and the biscuit weevils, and the 6 inches of standing bilge water that never fully drains no matter how often the pumps run, souring into something that smells like a swamp having a bad week. And yet, and this is the part worth sitting with for a second, men still chose this. Not all of them were forced like Barlow. A meaningful share of this crew walked away from merchant service, where the pay was worse, the captain's word was law with no appeal, and a lost hand or eye earned you nothing but a pat on the back and a walk to the poorhouse. We'll come back to that. For now, just know that the discomfort you're lying in tonight was, for some of these men, still the better of 2 bad options. Toward the bow, past a low bulkhead that does more to suggest privacy than to actually provide it, is the necessary, the ship's toilet, which on a vessel this size amounted to little more than a plank with a hole in it, positioned out at the head of the ship, in the open air, where the forward motion of the vessel was relied upon to carry the evidence away. Below decks, in the dark, men who couldn't be bothered to make that walk in the night used whatever was closest, and the bilge absorbed the consequences along with everything else. This is not a detail included for shock value, it's included because it's one of the plainest. Most physical reasons ships of this era were such efficient breeding grounds for dysentery, sometimes called the bloody flux, which killed more sailors across the age of sail than cannon fire ever did. You are, tonight, lying 8 feet from a hole that several dozen men have used as their toilet, and you are going to close your eyes anyway, because exhaustion outranks disgust most nights, and tonight is one of them. Not everyone is trying to sleep. Forward, past the mainmast step, a knot of 6 or 7 men are playing at dice by the light of a single shielded lantern, shielded because open flame below decks near a powder store is the kind of mistake a crew only makes once, and this crew has clearly had that lesson explained to them in vivid enough terms that nobody's testing it twice. They're playing for shares of a prize not yet taken, for tobacco, for a spare shirt somebody won off a merchant sailor 3 weeks back. It's loud in the particular way that off-duty men are loud when they've decided, collectively and without discussion, that tonight is a night to be loud. Somewhere behind them, tacked to a beam where the lantern light barely reaches, is a sheet of paper covered in cramped handwriting, the ship's articles, the written contract every man aboard signed or made his mark on before this voyage began, laying out shares of plunder, compensation for a lost limb, the rules against gambling money you don't have, and fighting below decks, and bringing a woman aboard in disguise. It is, in its way, one of the more startling documents of the era, a set of rules that gave common sailors more say over their own fate, an actual vote for captain, an actual formula for what a man was owed if he lost an eye or a leg in the taking of a prize, than almost anyone else at sea in 1718 could claim. We'll come back to those articles more than once tonight, because they matter more to how this story ends than the guns do. By 8 bells of the middle watch midnight, in the language of a ship's day, when the watch changes and the ship's boy strikes the bell 8 times to mark it, most of the dice players have finally given up and found somewhere to lie down, and the deck above has gone from a rolling thunder of footsteps to the ordinary creak and settle of a ship riding at anchor. You've drifted somewhere close to sleep. Barlow, beside you, has stopped running his thumb along invisible seams and gone still. This is, if you're keeping score, the last quiet 10 minutes of the night, and neither of you knows it yet. Somewhere above, a lookout posted at the masthead, a cold, exposed post that men drew lots to avoid, is staring out at a dark horizon lit only by starlight and the faint phosphorescence of the water, looking for exactly the thing he is about to find. What happens in the next few minutes is going to feel sudden from down here, in the dark, with no view of the water at all. But it wasn't sudden for the lookout. He'd been watching a shape on the horizon for the better part of 20 minutes before he was sure enough to call it. A shape with the wrong number of sails for a merchantman running this route this late, moving with a purposefulness that a trading vessel out for an honest night's sailing simply doesn't have. What he's looking at, though he can't yet say for certain in the dark, has the general silhouette of one of His Majesty's cruisers, and by 1718 there were several of those working these waters specifically, with specific orders and specific names. What that means for you, still half asleep in a hammock you'll remember for the rest of your life if you're lucky enough to have one, is coming next. The shout, when it comes, doesn't sound like the alarm you'd imagine. It's not a scream. It's a single word sail, called down the hatch in a voice trying very hard to stay level, followed almost immediately by a second word that does most of the actual damage. Warship. You are awake before your body has finished deciding to be awake, which is its own strange sensation, like your legs know something your brain hasn't caught up to yet. Around you, in the dark, 80 men are having the same half-second of paralysis, and then 80 men are not paralysed anymore. Barlow is already rolling out of his hammock beside you, and in the 2 seconds it takes him to find his feet, you watch him do something almost absurd given the moment. He reaches up and, in one practised motion, gathers the loose canvas of his own hammock into a tight roll and shoves it into the netting along the hull, out of the way. It's instinct built from 6 weeks of drilling into him that a loose hammock in a passageway during a scramble is how men break ankles in the dark. It will matter later that he did this without thinking. For now it just looks strange. A small island of order in a room that has gone entirely to noise. Here's the problem with the scramble, and it's a problem no amount of drilling fully solves. There is exactly one companionway leading up from this deck to the one above, a wooden ladder maybe 2 feet wide, and roughly 80 men are currently trying to use it at once. This is the pirate ship version of a sold-out concert with one exit door, except the band playing is the Royal Navy, and being late to the show has considerably worse consequences than a bad parking spot. Men shove. Someone's elbow catches your jaw. A voice you don't recognise is swearing in a steady, almost meditative stream, the kind of cursing that's less about anger and more about giving your hands and feet a rhythm to move to. You get a boot heel in your shin from the man ahead of you, and don't even have the breath to complain about it. This is, by every account we have of pirate crews under alarm, exactly how it went. Chaotic, physical, and over in a matter of a couple of minutes, because the alternative to getting up that ladder quickly was considerably worse than a bruised shin. Topside, the air is a genuine shock after the below-deck stew you've been breathing for hours. Cooler, saltier, moving, and there, off the starboard quarter, low and dark against a sky just barely lighter than the water, is the shape the lookout called. You can't see much detail at this range and in this light, but you don't need detail. You need silhouette, and the silhouette is wrong in a way your gut understands even before your brain finishes the analysis. Too many gunports for a merchantman. Too much sail set for a vessel that isn't in a hurry to be somewhere. Word moves through the crew almost as fast as the men themselves did coming up the ladder. This is very likely a king's ship, and in these waters. In the summer of 1718, that meant one of a small handful of vessels the Crown had specifically sent to hunt exactly the kind of ship you're currently standing on. Woodes Rogers, newly arrived as Governor of the Bahamas that very July, with a royal pardon in one hand for any pirate willing to surrender, had brought naval muscle along with the paperwork. Among the vessels escorting him into Nassau harbour was Miss Rose, a 20-gun frigate, part of a squadron specifically tasked with making the offer of mercy considerably more persuasive by also being able to hang the men who declined it. Your captain, and we're going to spend more time with a real captain who lived through exactly this kind of night later in tonight's journey, is already making the call that every pirate captain in this situation had to make almost instantly: fight, surrender, or run. Surrender to a Navy cruiser in 1718 without a pardon already secured meant an admiralty trial and a strong chance of a rope. Fighting a 20-gun frigate with a sloop's worth of guns was, in most cases, a losing proposition dressed up as an option, which leaves running, and running starts with a decision that sounds almost too simple to matter. What do you do about the anchor? Hauling it up properly, hand over hand at the capstan, takes precious minutes you may not have. Cutting the cable takes seconds and costs you nothing but an anchor you can replace at the next port that isn't currently trying to hang you. Your quartermaster gives the order in a low, hard voice, and somewhere at the bow an axe comes down on hemp rope thick as a man's wrist. The ship, freed of the thing that was holding it in place, begins, almost immediately, to feel different under your feet, looser, more alive, already leaning into the wind as canvas goes up around you faster than you've ever seen it go up in daylight drill. What strikes you, in the middle of all this, is how quiet the ship has gone even as it does more than it's done all night. Orders are given in low voices, not shouted. Nobody wants sound carrying across still water to a Navy lookout who might not yet be entirely certain what he's looking at. Barlow is at a halyard near you, hauling in a rhythm with 3 other men, and even now, mid-crisis. Mid-flight, 6 weeks into a life he never signed up for, he's counting the pulls under his breath, an old habit from sail work that keeps a gang's timing even in the dark. You notice it because it's the only steady thing happening within 10 feet of you. Here's the thing about fear in a scramble like this one. It doesn't feel like the fear you'd expect from a story. It's not paralysing. It's closer to a kind of hyper-competent panic, your hands doing a job they've drilled 100 times, while your chest does something considerably less composed. What happens over the next several hours, the actual chase? The decisions your captain makes about which channel to run for, whether the ship behind you is faster in this wind or slower in that one, is going to unfold across the whole rest of tonight's journey, because a chase like this one could stretch from a single tense hour to something closer to a day and a night strung together, depending on wind, water, and how badly the ship behind you wanted the ship you're standing on. What matters right now in this first scramble of the night is simpler than all of that. You are, as of this moment, a hunted man on a hunted ship, in waters the Royal Navy had specifically sailed to this part of the world to control. And whether you make it through this particular night, whether Barlow does, whether any of the 80 men currently hauling line in the dark around you do, depends on things that haven't happened yet. A few minutes into the run, a man named Peter Coyle, a genuine volunteer unlike Barlow, a corkman who signed the articles of his own free will after his last merchant captain flogged a boy half to death for napping on watch, comes scrambling aft from the bow with news for the quartermaster, and because you're standing in the way, you get the news second-hand before anyone official does. This is how information actually moved on a ship this size in the dark, not by announcement, but by relay, one man telling the next man what he'd seen with his own eyes, because there was no other way to spread it. Coyle had gone forward to check the cut cable, and gotten a longer look at their pursuer than most of you have had. Count near enough 20 ports aside, he says breathless, to nobody and everyone. 20 gun ports to a side is consistent with a small frigate of the period. Rose herself is recorded as carrying 20 guns, and if that's what's behind you, it outguns your sloops several times over, though it likely draws considerably more water too, which matters more than you'd think in these shallow, reef-strewn Bahamian channels. Coyle's news doesn't fix anything, but it does something almost as valuable. It turns an unknown shape on the water into a knowable threat, and a knowable threat, however bad, is easier to plan against than a shadow. Here's the part of tonight that's easy to miss under all the shouting and the rope burn and the very real chance that this could end badly. This crew, forced men and volunteers alike, has more say in what happens next than you might expect. Somewhere in the last hour, before the alarm ever went up, this ship's articles were signed by every man aboard, even Barlow. Forced men and prizes were still typically made to sign, if only to bind them to secrecy and to the ship's rules, though the circumstances of that signing were exactly the kind of thing Admiralty courts later spent real effort untangling. Those articles didn't just set out shares of plunder, they set out compensation, a fixed sum, sometimes in pieces of 8. Sometimes a share and a half instead of a full share going forward, for a man who lost an eye, a hand, a leg, in the taking of a prize or the defending of the ship. No merchant captain of this era was writing that clause into anyone's contract. No Royal Navy pay table offered anything close to it for an ordinary seaman maimed in the King's service. Whatever else is true about the ship you're standing on tonight, and whatever it's about to cost some of the men aboard it, it was, on paper and often enough in practice, one of the only workplaces on the entire ocean in 1718 where the men actually doing the dying had voted on who got to give the orders. That's not nothing. Hold on to that, because it's going to matter again before tonight is over. That uncertainty is where we'll leave this deck for now, canvas cracking overhead, a warship's silhouette shrinking or growing behind you, depending on whose account of the wind you believe. Before we follow this chase any further, though, it's worth understanding exactly what and who was doing the hunting, because the ship behind you tonight didn't happen to be there by accident. It was sent. Every hunted ship needs a hunter, and this one had several, arriving with a great deal more paperwork than pirates were used to. On the evening of the 22nd of July 1718, a young officer standing watch aboard one of His Majesty's cruisers off the coast of New Providence Island watched a French-built merchant ship burn to the waterline in Nassau's harbour mouth, and understood correctly that he was watching a trap. The fire had been set deliberately by a pirate named Charles Vane, who had loaded the doomed vessel with whatever combustibles he could gather and turned her loose downwind of the approaching British fleet, hoping the panic of a burning ship bearing down on them in the dark would scatter the Navy's line long enough for his own vessels to slip past. It didn't fully work, not that night, and we'll come back to exactly how Vane's escape actually played out later in tonight's journey, but the young officer's watch that evening captures something worth sitting with. By the summer of 1718, the fight between the Royal Navy and the pirates of the Bahamas had stopped being a rumour passed between colonial governors and become a fleet, sitting off a real harbour, doing real work. That fleet had a face, and it belonged to a man named Woodes Rogers, a former privateer who had once sailed around the entire world capturing Spanish treasure ships and was now at considerable personal financial risk, serving as the newly appointed governor of the Bahamas. Rogers arrived at Nassau in late July 1718, aboard his flagship, the 40-gun Delicia, escorted by 2 proper Royal Navy warships, Ms. Milford and Ms. Rose, along with 2 smaller armed sloops named Shark and Buck. He carried with him roughly 100 soldiers, a royal proclamation of pardon from King George I for any pirate willing to surrender before the 5th of September that year, and a considerably less forgiving set of instructions for anyone who declined. This is the system you were running from in the last chapter, or one very much like it, not a single angry captain chasing a single unlucky prize, but an organised state campaign, with a deadline, a paper trail, and warships, built specifically to outgun exactly the kind of vessel you'd been sleeping aboard. Here's the thing about a pardon deadline. It sounds generous right up until you realise what the alternative was. The document Rogers carried offered clemency, full and genuine, to any pirate who came in and surrendered before the 5th of September 1718. It did not offer anything at all to anyone who waited past that date, or who took the pardon and then went back to sea anyway, which a fair number of men did once the boredom or the debt or the simple pull of the trade caught up with them again. According to the surviving record, something in the neighbourhood of 600 pirates accepted the pardon in the weeks around Rogers's arrival, an extraordinary number, representing a meaningful fraction of the entire Bahamian pirate population at the time. Men trading a life on the account for a clean slate and, in many cases, considerably reduced circumstances back on land. Among them was a pirate named Benjamin Hornigold, one of the founding figures of Nassau's so-called Pirate Republic, and, not so long before, the man who had personally brought a young Edward Teach, soon to be known as Blackbeard, into the trade. Hornigold took the pardon, and Rogers, in one of the era's more pointed ironies, promptly sent him back out to sea armed and commissioned, this time to hunt down his former friends and colleagues. That's not a joke, though it has the shape of one. It's also, if you think about it for more than a second, one of the darker mechanics of how the Crown actually broke the back of Bahamian piracy, not purely through force, but by offering men a legal path out of a trade that was, for most of them, one bad storm or one lost limb away from ending badly regardless, and then turning the men who took that path loose on the ones who hadn't. Hornigold's usefulness to Rogers was almost immediate. Sent out after Vane and other holdouts, Hornigold managed to run down a party of 10 pirates on the island of Exuma, roughly 130 miles southeast of Nassau. Rogers, eager to demonstrate that the new order in the Bahamas had teeth as well as paperwork, decided to make an example. 8 of the 10 were hanged at Nassau on the 12th of December 1718, a public execution meant to be seen and talked about, and carried by word of mouth to every pirate crew still weighing whether the pardon or the account was the better bet. We know these numbers: the 600 pardoned, the 10 captured at Exuma, the 8 hanged in December, not from legend or from the sort of dramatised pirate biography that tends to blur fact and flourish, but from the more mundane paper trail of colonial government, governors' letters back to London, official proclamations, contemporary newspaper accounts of the period like the Boston Newsletter, which reported on Caribbean piracy and its suppression with the same appetite for detail that a modern paper might give a crime wave. This is worth pausing on, because it's easy to imagine the Golden Age of Piracy as something closer to myth than history. All treasure maps and skull flags. Underneath the myth is an enormous quantity of extremely dry, extremely real bureaucratic record, trial transcripts, customs reports, ship's musters. And that record is, if anything, more remarkable than the legend, because it describes something that actually happened to actual, named, traceable people. None of this paperwork made the ships themselves any less dangerous, and this is where the story loops back to the deck you were standing on earlier tonight. Hunts Rose, the 20-gun frigate that escorted Rogers into Nassau, didn't retire once the governor was safely ashore. She and her sister ship spent months on station in Bahamian waters, patrolling the channels and cays that pirate sloops had always relied on as an escape route, precisely because those same shallow, reef-choked waters that a light pirate sloop could skim across in 6 feet of water could ground a deep-draft frigate in an afternoon if her captain wasn't careful. This is the central, unglamorous fact at the heart of nearly every pirate night chase of this era. The Navy usually had more guns, and the pirates usually had more water under their keel. Whether a chase ended in an admiralty court or an escaped ship very often came down to which side of that trade-off mattered more in a given channel, on a given tide, in a given amount of moonlight. It is worth being honest, too, about what waited for a man on the losing end of that trade-off. An admiralty trial in this period was not a lengthy affair by modern standards. Testimony, deposition, verdict, and sentence could move through in a matter of days, sometimes for dozens of men at once. Conviction for piracy carried, overwhelmingly, a sentence of death by hanging, typically at a harbour's edge, at low tide, where the body would be visible to every ship coming and going as a piece of practical grim advertising. This is what waits for you here. Forced men like Barlow, taken unwillingly off a captured prize, had a genuine chance of acquittal or pardon if they could produce witnesses to testify they'd never signed the articles willingly, never taken a share of plunder, never fought. That chance was real, but it was not guaranteed, and it depended entirely on other men, often men who were themselves on trial for their lives, choosing to speak up on a forced man's behalf rather than staying quiet to save their own skin. We'll see exactly how much that mattered, and to whom before tonight's journey is over. By the last months of 1718, then this was the shape of the world your ship was sailing through, a crown deadline that had already come and gone, a fleet of navy cruisers with specific orders to hunt down everyone who hadn't taken it, a newly reinforced fort and garrison at Nassau, closing off the pirates' old home port, and a public gallows at the harbour's edge that had already, by December, claimed 8 men as proof the new governor meant exactly what he'd said. Somewhere out in those same waters, a sloop with roughly 80 souls aboard, including one forced sailmaker's mate who had never asked to be part of any of it, was still running, canvas cracking, hoping the water under its keel stayed shallow enough, long enough. The legal machinery behind all of this had been assembled a year earlier, back in London, in the form of an Act of Parliament, with the almost comically dry title of An Act for the More Effectual Suppression of Piracy, passed in 1717. The practical effect of that act was to extend something close to full admiralty jurisdiction out to the colonies themselves, meaning a captured pirate no longer had to be shipped across the Atlantic to stand trial in England, a process that could take months and, more than once, had let a case grow cold or a prisoner die of fever before a verdict was ever reached. Under the new act, a colonial governor like Rogers could convene a court of admiralty on the spot, in Nassau or Charleston or Williamsburg, try a captured crew within days of their capture, and carry out a sentence before word had even finished travelling home. It's the kind of detail that never makes it into the swashbuckling version of this story, and it's also, in its quiet bureaucratic way, one of the reasons the Golden Age of Piracy ended when it did. A trade that depended on distance and delay, on being harder to catch than to convict, got considerably more dangerous the moment the courts moved close enough to reach it in a week instead of a year. There was money in it too, and money tends to sharpen a hunter's focus in ways that patriotism alone rarely does. Royal Navy officers and crews who captured pirates were entitled to bounty payments and prize money under the same act. A fixed sum per pirate taken, scaled by rank, considerably more for a captain than a common seaman, but still enough for an ordinary sailor to matter. A ship's company that ran down and captured a pirate sloop wasn't just doing its duty, it was, in the plainest financial terms, getting paid for the trouble, sometimes handsomely enough to double or triple a man's ordinary wage for the voyage. This matters for understanding why a frigate captain might choose to press a chase harder and longer into the dangerous shallows than caution alone would recommend. Every additional hour spent hunting was, at least in theory, an hour spent earning. It's worth pausing here too on the men actually crewing Ms. Rose and her sister ships, because it would be a mistake to imagine them as some cleaner, more comfortable mirror of the misery below decks on a pirate sloop. Royal Navy service in 1718 relied heavily on impressment, the forced conscription of sailors, often dragged straight off merchant ships or out of dockside taverns by press gangs with legal authority to take them, whether they volunteered for the King's service or not. Discipline aboard a Navy vessel was, if anything, considerably harsher than aboard most pirate ships, enforced by the lash under formal articles of war rather than negotiated shares under a crew's own signed contract, and a Navy captain's word carried the weight of law with essentially no appeal available to the men serving under him. Pay was fixed, modest, and notoriously slow to actually arrive. Sailors sometimes waited months or years to be paid what they were owed. In an era when a pirate crew, by grim contrast, divided its plunder on the spot, the same night the prize was taken. None of this is offered to excuse anything the men on your sloop are doing tonight, or to romanticise piracy over service. It's offered because the honest picture of 1718 is messier than hunter and hunted, and because more than one sailor of this era, weighing a navy berth against a pirate's articles, made the second choice specifically because the math and the mercy both worked out better on that side of the account. None of this campaign existed in a vacuum. Either it existed because pirates had spent the previous 2 years making themselves impossible for the Crown to ignore. Just 2 months before Rogers dropped anchor at Nassau, in May of 1718, the pirate Edward Teach, Blackbeard, whose own final night is waiting for you later in tonight's journey, had blockaded the harbour of Charleston, South Carolina, with a small flotilla of his own, stopping incoming and outgoing ships at will, holding hostages, and extracting a ransom of medical supplies before finally sailing off with his reputation, if anything, enlarged rather than diminished. An event like that, reported up through colonial governors and printed in newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic, is precisely the kind of provocation that turns a scattered colonial nuisance into a crown priority with a budget, a fleet, and a deadline attached. By the time Rogers's ships dropped anchor off Nassau 2 months later, the pardon he carried and the guns escorting him were not a first response. They were what happens after patience runs out. A blockade and a bounty are only as good as the intelligence behind them, and this is where the Navy's advantage got considerably less glamorous and considerably more effective. Much of what Rogers and his captains knew about which pirate crews were where and what they were sailing came from informants, pardoned pirates like Hornigold trading knowledge for their own safety, captured crewmen turning king's evidence in exchange for leniency at trial, and the ordinary gossip of a colonial waterfront where a sloop returning with an unusual quantity of Spanish silver and no obvious cargo manifest tended to attract exactly the kind of attention its captain would have preferred to avoid. Letters seized from captured ships were read for names, dates, and rendezvous points. Tavern keepers in port towns up and down the American coast, some of them happy to trade in stolen goods, but considerably less happy to hang for it, passed word to colonial officials about which crews had recently come ashore to drink through a share of plunder. None of this made for dramatic reading in the ship's logs, but it built, patiently, over months, the kind of picture that let a governor decide where to send a frigate on a given night, rather than simply hoping to stumble across a pirate sloop by chance. The ships themselves were built for exactly this kind of extended, grinding patrol work, rather than for the sudden, decisive battles more familiar from popular imagination. Rose, at 20 guns, was what the Navy classified as a sixth-rate frigate, smaller than a ship of the line, but still carrying more than double the firepower of most pirate sloops, and crewed by something in the range of 130 men, considerably better drilled in gunnery than an average pirate crew, whose fighting strength lay more in numbers and intimidation than in disciplined broadsides. What Rose lacked, and what her captain would have known better than anyone, was the shallow draft manoeuvrability of the vessels she'd been sent to hunt. A frigate like this one typically drew somewhere in the neighbourhood of 12 to 14 feet of water fully loaded, plenty of ship to survive rough Atlantic weather, and plenty of ship to run hard aground on a Bahamian sandbar that a pirate sloop, drawing perhaps 6 or 7 feet, could cross without even shortening sail. Every captain on both sides of this hunt understood that trade-off intimately, because it was the single fact most likely to decide, on any given night, whether the chase ended in a capture or a curse shouted uselessly across widening water. That gap between firepower and manoeuvrability is, in the end, the whole quiet drama of a Bahamian night chase in 1718, a slower, better-armed hunter forced to choose, again and again, between closing the distance and running the very real risk of losing the entire ship to a reef that its prey had sailed across without a second thought. It's a less cinematic kind of tension than cannon fire, but it's the one that actually governed most of these encounters, hour after hour, tide after tide, all across the waters south and east of Nassau in the back half of 1718. It's worth remembering, finally, that the pressure in a night chase like this one didn't run in only one direction. A Navy captain who let a known pirate sloop slip past him in the dark, who hesitated or misjudged a channel, or simply lost the shape of his quarry against the horizon, answered for it too, in his own way. Correspondence between colonial governors of the period is dotted with pointed complaints about naval captains judged too cautious, too slow, or too easily satisfied with an empty patrol log. And a captain's career, reputation, and future commands could rise or fall on results that were, in the end, largely out of his hands the moment the chase moved into water only the smaller ship could safely cross. So while you, below decks on that pirate sloop, were running from cannon and a rope, the men chasing you were running too, in their own quieter way, from something almost as unforgiving, a governor's letter home, and the judgment of men who had never once had to actually thread a frigate through a Bahamian reef in the dark to earn it. Part of how that system reached individual, named men, rather than just a vague category of criminals, was through formal proclamations naming specific wanted captains outright, rather than treating piracy as some faceless collective threat. Royal proclamations and colonial governors' bulletins circulated through this period, listing particular pirate captains by name. Alongside the specific rewards offered for their capture, Charles Vane and Edward Teach both appeared, at various points in 1718 and after, on exactly this kind of named list, their reputations having grown notorious enough that the Crown found it worthwhile to single them out individually, rather than simply offering a general bounty per pirate captured. Being named this way cut both directions for the men involved. It confirmed a captain's fearsome reputation in exactly the way Blackbeard's whole self-presentation depended on, and it also meant that every colonial official, every informant, every tavern keeper with loose lips along the American coast now had a specific face and a specific sum of money to think about every time a suspicious sloop came into port. Fame in this particular trade was never entirely separable from exposure, and the same reputation that let a captain intimidate a merchant crew into surrendering without a fight also made him considerably easier for the Crown's growing intelligence network to track down. The system chasing you had a face and a name and a paper trail, an Act of Parliament behind it, a bounty schedule sharpening it, and a gallows at the harbour's edge to make its point stick. But it also had holes in it, gaps in a blockade, moments of darkness, a stretch of water too shallow for a king's ship to follow into, that a bold enough captain could still slip through if his nerve held, and his luck did too. Nobody in 1718 proved that better, or more infuriatingly for the navy officers watching him do it from the deck of their own becalmed frigate, than the pirate who lit that fireship in Nassau's harbour mouth in the first place, on the very night Woodes Rogers arrived to close the noose. But before we get to Charles Vane and his burning ship, let's go back to the deck you never really left, because knowing who was chasing you doesn't change what your own hands still have to do in the next few hours, and there is a great deal of work left before this night is decided either way. Spray comes over the bow in warm sheets, and you taste salt on your lips before you've even registered that you're soaked through. The wind has picked up since the anchor cable was cut, and the sloop beneath your feet has that particular alive, straining feel of a hull pushed harder than it's usually asked to go, every timber working, every line singing under load. You've got a rope in your hands, coiled and ready, though you couldn't say precisely what it's for. In a scramble like this one, you go where the nearest experienced man points you, and you pull when he tells you to pull. That's not a comfortable way to spend a night at sea, taking orders you don't fully understand from men who are themselves half-guessing, but it beats the alternative, which is standing still and being useless, while 80 other men decide your fate for you. The first real decision your captain makes, once the ship is clear of the anchorage and running, is the kind that sounds almost too practical to be dramatic: what to throw overboard. A lighter ship sails faster. Plain and simple. And pirate crews facing exactly this situation are documented across multiple contemporary accounts, jettisoning cargo, spare spars, even guns, to shave weight and gain speed on a pursuer. Somewhere forward, men are rolling barrels of salt provisions to the rail and heaving them into the dark water, food that took real effort to steal in the first place, gone in seconds, because tonight's speed is worth more than next month's dinner. A cask of water goes over too, then another, the crew doing quick, brutal arithmetic about how many days they can survive on what's left versus how many minutes they might gain right now. Here's the thing about this kind of sacrifice. Nobody debates it. Nobody votes on it the way the articles say they're supposed to vote on larger questions. In an emergency like this one, the quartermaster's word moves fast, and nobody argues, because arguing is a luxury that belongs to calmer water. Within the first half hour of open water, the sloop has settled into something like a rhythm, and you finally get a proper look at the shape behind you, smaller now, or seeming smaller, though whether that's distance or just hope is hard to say in the dark. Somewhere near the mainmast, Josiah Barlow is on his knees over a torn strip of the mainsail's foot, a rip that opened somewhere in the first frantic minutes of setting canvas too fast in the dark. He's working a sailmaker's needle through heavy canvas by feel more than sight, his palm guard slapping the needle through with short, practiced strokes. Because a sail that fails now, mid-chase, could cost the ship everything the crew is currently risking their lives to buy. It's not glamorous work. Nobody's writing songs about the man stitching canvas in the dark while cannon fire is still, at least theoretically, a possibility. But it's exactly the kind of unglamorous, essential labour that decided more of these chases than swordplay ever did, and Barlow, forced aboard, still not a willing pirate by any honest definition, is doing it anyway, because a torn sail doesn't care whose choice put you on this ship. Below, near the two small guns this sloop carries, modest armament, 4 to 6 guns being typical for a vessel this size, nothing close to a frigate's broadside, the ship's gunner and a boy of perhaps 13 or 14 are readying powder and shot, just in case tonight ends in a fight rather than a foot race. That boy is what the era called a powder monkey, a role filled overwhelmingly by young or small crew members because their size let them move quickly through cramped spaces carrying charges from the magazine to the guns. It is worth sitting with, for a moment, exactly how young some of the hands aboard ships like this one actually were. Ships boys of 12, 13, 14 turn up again and again in the muster rolls and trial records of the period. Some there by choice, chasing adventure or escaping worse prospects ashore. Some forced exactly as Barlow was. Tonight, if it comes to guns, that boy's job is to keep running powder up a ladder in the dark while grown men fire cannon over his head. We won't make a joke out of that. Some things in this story are just going to sit there, heavy, and you're allowed to feel the weight of them. By the second hour of the chase, a kind of exhausted, watchful calm has settled over the deck. Not relief, nothing so complete as relief, but the particular numbness that comes after the body has spent everything it had to spend on pure adrenaline and has to find some other fuel to keep going. Your hands ache from rope work. Your mouth is dry, and you're rationing sips from a water skin because nobody's certain how long tonight is actually going to last. Somewhere in the dark Aston, the pursuing ship's lanterns, if she's showing any at all, which a cautious captain might not, flicker in and out of sight behind swells, and every crew member on your deck has developed, in the space of 2 hours, an amateur and completely unscientific method of judging distance by lantern brightness that nobody would trust in daylight and everybody trusts completely right now. It's worth understanding, in the middle of all this exhausted effort, exactly who is actually in charge of deciding where this ship goes next, because it isn't only the captain, and that distinction matters more tonight than it would on a calm day. Pirate crews of this era typically operated under a structure that split authority in a way almost no other ship at sea did. The captain held near total power during a chase or a fight, when split-second decisions were the difference between escape and capture. But the quartermaster held equal or even greater authority over the ship's day-to-day affairs, disputes between crew members, and the fair division of plunder. It was the quartermaster, not the captain, who most crews trusted to keep a captain's power in check, and it was the quartermaster who could, under many crews' articles, be voted to challenge or even depose a captain judged too reckless or too cowardly. Tonight, in the thick of the chase itself, that balance of power has swung hard toward the captain. This is exactly the moment the articles carved out for him to simply decide, fast, without a vote. Because a democratic debate about which channel to run for is a democracy that gets everyone caught. But the fact that this crew went back to voting once the danger passed, on other nights, about other questions, is part of what separated a pirate ship from almost every other vessel afloat in the British Atlantic in 1718. Nearing what would be, by ship's reckoning, somewhere around 1 a.m, the wind shifts a point, and your captain makes his second major decision of the night. Rather than trying to simply outrun a faster, better-armed ship in open water, he turns the sloop's head toward a stretch of shallower water he knows, and the navy captain behind you, in all likelihood, does not know nearly as well. This is the single greatest tactical advantage a pirate crew of this era typically held over the navy hunting them. Not better guns, not better men, but better knowledge of exactly the kind of treacherous, reef-choked, chart-defying water that most naval officers of the period had good reason to avoid pushing a valuable king's ship into after dark. Local knowledge, built from years of smuggling and privateering and simple familiarity with a home ground, was worth more tonight than the 2 extra guns the ship behind you was carrying. A lookout posted forward, a different man than the one who first raised the alarm hours ago, watches rotating even in the middle of a chase because exhausted eyes make fatal mistakes, calls back that the pursuing ship's lights seem to be falling astern, though he says it carefully, hedged, unwilling to promise something the dark might still take back from you. It's the first genuinely hopeful thing anyone has said aloud in 2 hours, and you watch it move through the crew almost like a change in the wind itself, shoulders unclenching a fraction. A low exchange of words between 2 men near the helm that might in a different circumstance have been a laugh. Barlow, still near the mainsail he stitched an hour ago, allows himself something you haven't seen from him since he came aboard 6 weeks ago as a forced man. He closes his eyes for just a moment, not in fear, but in something closer to relief, and when he opens them again, he catches you watching him and gives the smallest possible nod, the kind 2 strangers share when they've survived something together without ever quite becoming friends. It is a small thing. It is also, on a ship like this one, transient and often coerced as it was, close to the only kind of tenderness available, not a village's warmth, but the specific hard-won solidarity of men who hold the same lines in the dark and are, for the moment, still alive to talk about it. Fear, over the course of a 2-hour chase, doesn't stay in one shape. It arrived in that first scramble up the companionway as something close to pure animal panic, all noise and elbows and no room for thought. By the second hour it's turned into something slower and stranger, a low grinding awareness that sits behind everything else you're doing, the way a toothache sits behind a conversation. You find yourself doing small, useless things to manage it, counting your own heartbeat, running through the names of every man you can see on deck as if reciting them might keep the list from getting shorter, checking and rechecking a knot you already know is sound. One of the older hands near you, a weathered man missing most of 2 fingers on his left hand from some earlier mishap he's never fully explained, notices you doing it and offers the kind of dry, worn-in joke that seasoned crews always seem to have ready for exactly this moment. Something about how a hanging only takes a few seconds, and a chase like this one has already lasted longer than that. So by his math, you're already ahead. It's not a good joke. It doesn't need to be. What it needs to do is remind you that you're not the only frightened person on this deck, and it does that job perfectly well. Word moves down the length of the ship in fragments, the way it always does when nobody has the full picture and everybody's contributing a piece. A topman working near the mainmast calls down that he thinks he saw the pursuing ship's bowswing wide a few minutes back, as if her helmsman had to correct hard for something unseen in the water. A shoal, maybe, or a current running against him. Nobody can confirm it. Nobody needs to. Not really. The report travels from man to man anyway, gaining a little confidence with each retelling the way rumours do, because a frightened crew wants a reason to hope almost as badly as it wants a reason to run. This is, in its own small way, exactly how information moved on ships like this one throughout the era, not through any official channel, but through exactly this kind of relay, second-hand and imperfect, shaped as much by what men wanted to be true as by what they'd actually seen. It's also, historically, not an implausible detail at all. Contemporary accounts of pirate chases through Bahamian and Carolina waters repeatedly describe pursuing Navy vessels forced to shorten sail, alter course, or abandon a chase entirely rather than risk their hull on water or lighter. More shallow-drafted pirate vessel crossed without hesitation. Blackbeard's own flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, would run hard aground on a sandbar off Beaufort Inlet the following June, under circumstances still debated by historians, proof enough, if any were needed, that even the men who knew these waters best weren't immune to losing that particular gamble. There's a stretch, somewhere past midnight, where the wind drops away almost entirely, and for a long, sick handful of minutes, the sloop sits nearly dead in the water, sails hanging slack, while everyone aboard strains to hear whether the ship behind you is having better luck with what breeze remains. This is the moment sloops of this era were specifically built to survive, and it's not something a heavier frigate could easily match. Your ship carries sweeps, long oars, a dozen or more of them, stowed along the rail for exactly this contingency, and at a barked order, men move to the gunwales and run them out. Rowing a laden sloop is slow, brutal, unglamorous work, closer to a galley than anything you'd picture aboard a proper sailing ship. And it buys speed measured in fractions of a knot, rather than anything dramatic. But a fraction of a knot, in dead calm, with a heavier ship behind you unable to do the same thing nearly as effectively with her own boats, is sometimes the entire difference between escape and capture. You take an oar when one's shoved into your hands, and for the next 20 minutes your entire world narrows down to the ache in your shoulders and the man across from you setting the stroke, low and even, because a ragged stroke wastes energy nobody aboard can afford to waste tonight. It's in the middle of this grinding, silent effort that you notice a man near the bow being helped below by two others, his right hand wrapped hastily in a strip of someone's shirt, dark at the centre in a way you don't need better light to understand. His name, you learn later, is Thomas Pruitt, and in the chaos of that first scramble up the companionway, hours ago now, a swinging block caught his hand against the hatch coaming and crushed two fingers badly enough that the ship's makeshift surgeon. More often a man with some rough experience and a set of tools than any formal training is going to have difficult decisions to make about them before the night is through. What happens next is the part worth sitting with. The quartermaster, passing on his way to check the sweeps, stops long enough to ask Pruitt's name and have it noted, not out of idle concern in the middle of a crisis, but because the ship's articles this crew signed specify, in writing, exactly what a man is owed for an injury suffered in the ship's service, and the quartermaster's job includes making certain that promise gets kept even in the worst possible moment to be thinking about paperwork. It won't fix Pruitt's hand. It won't undo tonight, but it means that whatever else this chase costs him, he is not simply going to be quietly forgotten below decks the way an injured man aboard almost any merchant vessel of this era typically was, with no recourse and no promised compensation beyond whatever pity his captain happened to feel. That distinction, small, procedural, easy to miss in the noise of a chase, is one of the clearest pieces of evidence we have that a pirate crew, whatever else it was, operated by a different and in some ways more humane logic than most of the legitimate maritime world around it. The wind returns, eventually, the way it almost always does in these latitudes, a light land breeze picking up off some unseen quay ahead of you, filling the sails just enough to let the sweeps be shipped again, oars dragged back inboard by aching arms grateful for the reprieve. The sloop gathers way once more, and somewhere behind you, in the dark, the pursuing frigate is either doing the same or she isn't, and for a long while nobody aboard your ship can say for certain which. Thirst becomes its own quiet enemy somewhere in the third hour, sharper than hunger and harder to ignore than exhaustion, because rowing and hauling line under a warm night sky burns through a body's water faster than anyone standing calmly on deck would guess. The water skin passed hand to hand along your row of sweeps is measured out in small, deliberate sips now, not because anyone's ordered strict rationing, but because every man aboard has done the same rough arithmetic. Barrels went overboard hours ago to save weight. And nobody knows yet whether tonight ends in an hour or well past dawn. You watch the man across from you take his sip and pass the skin on without complaint, and there's something almost ceremonial in how carefully it moves down the line, each man trusting the next not to take more than his share. It's a small unspoken echo of the larger system this whole crew lives under, shares divided fairly, even now, even over something as unglamorous as a mouthful of warm. Slightly brackish water in the middle of a chase that could still end in a rope. Nobody comments on it, nobody needs to. It's just how this crew has learned, across enough close calls, to get through the parts of a night that no amount of skill at the helm can shorten. The night isn't over, and there is still real reason to be afraid. A shift in wind, a misjudged channel, a lookout on the other ship, finally getting a clean look at your sails, could still undo everything the last 2 hours brought you. But for the first time since the alarm went up, there is room on this deck for something other than pure fear, and that matters more than it might sound like it should. Pruitt is resting below now, his hand bound properly, his name entered against the ship's articles in whatever rough ledger this crew keeps such things. Barlow has gone quiet again near the mainmast, watching the dark water slide past. You are, against what felt like fairly long odds 2 hours ago, still afloat, still free, still breathing salt air instead of the fetid stillness of an Admiralty Court's holding cell. What you don't know yet, standing at that rail with salt drying stiff on your skin, is that not every pirate crew facing this exact situation, in these exact waters, in this exact year, chose to run quietly the way yours has. One of them chose something far more audacious, a fireship, a blockade, and a captain's flat refusal to accept the King's mercy on any terms but his own. And it happened close enough to where you're standing tonight, that word of it will reach this crew before the week is out. Word of that other chase would take a few days to reach any ship still working the outer channels, but it happened first, and it happened close by, in the harbour mouth of Nassau itself, on the very night Governor Woodes Rogers arrived to close the noose on the whole pirate republic at once. The fire took hold fast. A captured French merchant ship, gutted of anything worth keeping, and packed instead with pitch, tar, and whatever else would burn hot and bright, drifted downwind through the darkness of Nassau's harbour mouth on the night of the 24th or 25th of July, 1718, trailing flame and black smoke across water, crowded with some of the largest concentration of Royal Navy tonnage the Bahamas had seen in years. Aboard a sloop waiting at the harbour's edge, a pirate captain named Charles Vane watched his own improvised weapon do exactly what he'd hoped. Force Woodes Rogers's escorting warships to scatter and manoeuvre clear of the burning hulk bearing down on them, opening, for a matter of minutes, a gap in a blockade that had looked, only an hour earlier, entirely closed. Vane did not wait to see how completely the trick would work. He gave the order, and his own vessel, along with several others loyal enough or desperate enough to follow him, drove straight for that gap under full sail, muskets and swivel guns firing defiantly at the Navy ships he was passing, rather than surrendering to any of them. By the time the smoke cleared and Rogers's furious captains had regained control of their own manoeuvring, Charles Vane was gone, out past the reef line and into open water, the only major pirate captain in Nassau that night who had looked at a king's pardon and a king's fleet and chosen neither. Almost nothing certain survives about who Charles Vane was before piracy made him notorious, which is itself telling, unlike better documented contemporaries such as Blackbeard, whose earlier service as a privateer during the War of the Spanish Succession left at least some trace in the record. Vane appears to have arrived in the Caribbean's pirate world from something close to obscurity. What we do know, with reasonable confidence, comes from his time serving under the privateer-turned-pirate Henry Jennings around 1715 and 1716, part of a loose confederation of English sailors who made their early fortunes not by taking ships at sea at all, but by raiding the wreck camps of a Spanish treasure fleet that had gone down off the Florida coast in a hurricane, stealing salvaged silver directly from the Spanish divers and soldiers guarding it. This was technically piracy against Spain rather than England, in the murky legal territory many of these men occupied, before eventually turning to open, indiscriminate raiding of any flag. The wreck raid that first put men like Vane on the map deserves a moment of its own, because it's a stranger story than the standard image of pirates simply seizing ships at sea. In the summer of 1715, a Spanish treasure fleet of a dozen or so ships, loaded with silver and goods bound from Havana back to Spain, was caught in a hurricane and wrecked along a long stretch of Florida's eastern coast, scattering an enormous quantity of coin and cargo across shallow water that Spanish salvage crews immediately set about recovering under armed guard. From a camp established on shore, word of the wreck and the silver being pulled from it reached Jamaica within weeks, and Henry Jennings, the privateer Captain Vane was then sailing under, organised a raid not against a ship at sea, but against the Spanish salvage camp itself, landing armed men, overwhelming the guards, and making off with a substantial portion of already recovered silver, reportedly numbering in the hundreds of thousands of pieces of eight, though exact figures vary between surviving accounts. It was piracy against an ally nation in everything but the strictest technical sense, and it was enormously suddenly profitable in a way that ordinary privateering rarely managed. Vane, present for at least part of this campaign, would have seen firsthand just how much money moved through this loosely policed corner of the Atlantic world for men willing to take the risk, a lesson that shaped the rest of his short, violent career considerably more than any single ship he later captured at sea. Vane rose through this world quickly, and by the time he had his own command, he'd built a reputation, even among a profession not exactly known for gentleness, as an unusually harsh and vindictive captain, one whose treatment of captured crews stood out enough that surviving depositions from his victims specifically single out his cruelty in an era when most pirate captains, purely for practical reasons of reputation and future ransom prospects, preferred to let a cooperative merchant crew go largely unharmed. By the time Woodes Rogers's fleet appeared off Nassau in July of 1718, Vane was one of the more prominent captains still operating out of the loosely organised pirate stronghold that history has come to call the Flying Gang, a rotating cast of captains. Vane and Blackbeard and Hornigold and others among them, who used New Providence Island's excellent natural harbour and its near-total absence of any functioning government as a base to careen their ships, divide their plunder, and drink through it in relative safety. That safety depended entirely on the Crown's continued indifference, and by 1718 the Crown was no longer indifferent. When Rogers's pardon was read out to the assembled pirates of Nassau, the overwhelming majority, as you already know from earlier in tonight's journey, took it. Vane did not. According to the record, he refused publicly and defiantly, apparently unwilling to accept a peace that would have required him to give up both his trade and, quite possibly, some portion of plunder the Crown might still have wanted answered for. This is the story of Charles Vane, the pirate who looked at the one guaranteed path back to a legal, unhanged life that nearly every other captain in Nassau accepted that summer, and burned a ship rather than take it. What followed the fireship escape was not, in the end, a triumphant new chapter for Vane so much as a long, grinding decline, and it's worth following that decline honestly rather than letting the drama of the escape stand in for the whole story. Vane continued raiding through the remainder of 1718 and into 1719, but his fortunes and his authority over his own crew both slipped. The clearest documented turning point came when Vane's ship encountered a heavily armed French vessel, and Vane, by most surviving accounts, judged the fight too dangerous and chose to withdraw rather than engage, a decision his own quartermaster, a man named John Rackham who would go on to considerable fame of his own under the nickname Calico Jack, apparently considered cowardice rather than caution. The scene aboard ship that night, as later accounts describe it, is worth picturing plainly, a crew gathered on deck by lantern light, the French vessel they just avoided still visible somewhere off the stern, and Rackham, not a captain himself yet, only the quartermaster. But a quartermaster's authority in a moment like this was exactly the kind the articles had built for, putting the question to the men directly, asking them plainly whether they still trusted the man giving them orders. Under the terms of the very articles that gave a pirate crew its structure and its say, Rackham put the question of Vane's fitness to command to a vote, and the crew turned against their captain. There was no appeal available to Vane once the count went against him, no higher authority to petition, no admiral's commission to fall back on the way a Royal Navy captain stripped of his command might still have retained his rank and pay. A pirate captaincy, won by vote, could be lost by vote just as fast, and Vane, the same man who defied an entire Royal Navy blockade rather than accept a king's mercy, found himself with no recourse whatsoever against the judgment of 80 or so of his own men. It's a strange, almost dizzying reversal to sit with, the very system that gave common sailors more say over their fate than almost anyone else afloat in 1718, turned, in a single vote, into the instrument of Vane's own undoing. Vane was deposed, an almost unthinkable outcome for most ships' captains anywhere else in the 18th century Atlantic world, where a captain's authority came from a commission or a title rather than a ballot among the men he commanded, and set adrift in a small sloop with a handful of men still loyal enough to follow him, while Rackham took the larger vessel and the greater part of the crew. Vane's final months read like a slow unwinding of everything the fireship escape had briefly won him. Reduced to a much smaller command, he continued a diminished form of piracy through the Caribbean, until, in February of 1719, a hurricane caught his ship off the coast of what is now Honduras and wrecked it entirely. Vane survived, apparently as one of only a small handful who did, and washed up on a small, largely uninhabited island in the Bay of Honduras with little more than what he could carry, forced to live off fish, shellfish, and whatever else the island could provide, in circumstances considerably closer to genuine castaway desperation than to any romantic legend of buried treasure. What happened next carries an irony sharp enough that it would feel implausible in fiction. A passing ship eventually stopped near the island for fresh water, and its captain turned out to be a man named Holford, an old acquaintance of Vane's from his own piratical days, who had since taken the pardon and turned respectable. Holford recognised his former colleague immediately, and, according to the surviving accounts of the encounter, refused to take him aboard at all, reportedly telling Vane bluntly that he knew him too well to trust him anywhere near his crew, for fear Vane would talk the men into mutiny and a return to piracy before the voyage was through. It is one of history's more pointed rejections. Even stranded and starving, Charles Vane's reputation preceded him badly enough that an old friend chose to leave him on the island rather than risk it. Vane was eventually picked up by a different, unsuspecting ship, and for a brief while it must have seemed as though his luck had genuinely turned. It hadn't. A member of that second ship's crew recognised him from an earlier encounter, and Vane was identified, arrested, and delivered to the authorities at Port Royal, Jamaica, brought at last into exactly the kind of Admiralty proceeding he had refused to walk into voluntarily back in Nassau nearly 3 years earlier. He was held in custody for close to a year before his case was finally heard. Tried before a Vice-Admiralty court in March of 1721 on charges covering multiple specific acts of piracy against named vessels, and found guilty. No confession, no plea for mercy, no repentant speech survives from Vane in the record, a silence that, set against the standard script condemned pirates of this period, were generally expected to perform on the gallows. Fits the pattern of a man who never once, from the night of that fireship to the end, gave the authorities the submission they wanted from him. It's worth stepping back from Vane the man for a moment to look at Vane's ship, because a fireship escape like the one that made him famous only works if the vessel doing the escaping is built for exactly that kind of desperate manoeuvre. Vane's command through most of his active piracy was a brigantine he called the Ranger, a fast, two-masted vessel, smaller and considerably more nimble than the lumbering merchant ships and naval frigates it was built to outrun, rigged in a way that let a skilled crew claw closer to the wind and change heading faster than almost anything the Royal Navy could put in the water to chase her. A brigantine like the Ranger typically carried somewhere in the range of a dozen or so guns, enough to intimidate an unarmed merchantman into surrendering without a fight. Nowhere near enough to trade broadsides with a proper man of war, which is precisely why Vane's entire strategy on the night of the fireship depended on never actually having to fight his way out at all. The trick wasn't force. It was speed, nerve, and a burning decoy doing the fighting for him. Fireships themselves were nothing new by 1718. Naval commanders had been using burning, unmanned vessels to break up enemy formations for well over a century, most famously against the Spanish Armada in 1588. A full 130 years before Vane borrowed the same idea on a considerably smaller and more improvised scale in a single Bahamian harbour. There's something almost comic, in the driest possible sense, about one of history's most disorganised pirate captains reaching back to one of the Royal Navy's own proudest tactical victories and turning it against a fleet flying the same flag. Vane, whatever else can be said about him, clearly knew his history, or at least knew enough of it to borrow the right idea at the right moment. Charles Vane's story has had a longer afterlife than his actual piracy did, and it's worth being honest about where that afterlife comes from, since it says something about how these stories get passed down at all. Much of what later writers embellished about Vane, his exact words in various confrontations, the finer details of his cruelty, private conversations no outside witness could have recorded, traces back at least partly to Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 book, A General History of the Pirates, a foundational and enormously influential source for this entire era, but one whose own authorship remains disputed among historians and which is known, in multiple documented instances, to have dramatised or simply invented material to make for a better read. Where this account has drawn on Johnson-adjacent details, it has tried to flag them as such, rather than presenting them as flatly settled fact, the same caution worth applying to nearly every colourful pirate anecdote from this period that doesn't trace back to a deposition, a court record, or a governor's letter. What we can say with real confidence about Vane comes from those drier sources, the sworn statements of his victims, the official correspondence describing his refusal of the pardon, the trial record of March 1721. Everything else, the exact tone of his defiance, the precise words exchanged with Holford on that island beach, survives to us filtered through storytellers who came after, and deserves to be held a little more loosely. On the 29th of March 1721, Charles Vane was hanged at Gallows Point, Port Royal, the same stretch of Jamaican coastline where decades earlier an entire generation of Caribbean pirates and privateers had made their names and their fortunes. His body was afterward gibbeted, locked into an iron cage and displayed at the harbour's entrance, a piece of grim civic theatre meant to be seen by every crew sailing in or out of port, in precisely the same spirit as the 8 bodies left hanging at Nassau's harbour edge 2.5 years earlier, and precisely the same spirit too, as the black and red flags you'll hear the fuller story of shortly, different tools, the gibbet and the flag both, but built from the very same logic that a visible public reminder of what awaited the defiant was worth more than any private punishment could ever be. It is worth noting, for anyone tempted to romanticise the ending, that this was the fate the fireship escape had ultimately brought him. Not freedom, not fortune, but roughly 2.5 additional years of a shrinking, increasingly desperate life on the run, followed by the exact rope he'd refused in July of 1718. Life aboard the Ranger under Vane's command, in the months between the fireship escape and his own crew's eventual mutiny against him, followed the same basic structure you already know well from your own time below decks earlier tonight, articles signed by every man. Shares divided according to rank and role, a quartermaster's authority checking a captain's power in everything but the heat of an actual chase or fight. What made Vane's crew increasingly unstable wasn't a breakdown of that structure so much as a breakdown of trust in the man occupying its top position. A captain voted into command on the promise of profitable. Well-judged leadership could just as easily be voted out again the moment enough of the crew decided he'd stopped delivering on that promise, and by the time the confrontation with the French vessel arrived, plenty of men aboard the Ranger had apparently already concluded that Vane's judgment, however useful it had been in a burning Nassau harbour, was no longer serving their own survival and their own profit nearly as well as it once had. Rackham's challenge when it came wasn't a coup so much as the system working precisely as the articles had designed it to work, a captain's fitness judged continuously, by vote, by the very men whose lives depended on his decisions. Defiance, in Vane's case, delayed the inevitable considerably longer than surrender would have. It did not, in the end, prevent it. Back on the night of the escape itself, aboard the Royal Navy ships Vane had just humiliated, the confusion took considerably longer to settle than his own clean getaway suggests. Captains who had spent the evening arranging their vessels into a careful blockading line found that line broken by a burning hulk none of them had authorised, and none of them could safely approach. And in the scramble to avoid the fire, at least one warship reportedly fouled her own anchor cable trying to maneuver clear, losing precious minutes she could have spent in pursuit. By the time any order was restored, Vane's sails had shrunk to nothing against the dark horizon, and Woodes Rogers, who had arrived that same day to claim, on paper, total victory over Nassau's pirate republic, spent his very first night as governor watching the one captain who mattered most to catch sail cleanly away from him. It's a detail worth holding on to, because it's a useful corrective to any version of this story that makes the Royal Navy's campaign sound like a smooth, inevitable machine grinding down every pirate in its path. The machine was real, and it eventually won, but on this particular night, in this particular harbour, it fumbled badly enough that a single defiant captain in a two-masted brigantine made every gun in that blockade look, for a few humiliating minutes, entirely beside the point. That kind of narrow, nerve-driven escape wasn't only a captain's trick, either, it depended, every time, on ordinary details playing out exactly right below decks, and on the rigging, on the same kind of unglamorous readiness you already watched play out earlier tonight aboard a very different sloop. Which brings the story back, one more time, to a ship not so different from Vane's, and to the men who kept her afloat through her own long night of running. Dawn comes up grey, and then gold over water that has, sometime in the last hour, gone from black to a pale, readable blue, and the ship behind you, the one you spent half the night straining to see, is nowhere in sight at all. Nobody cheers. You're too tired for that, and there's a kind of superstition among tired men that celebrating too early invites the thing you're celebrating escaping from to come back. Instead, the crew goes about the ordinary business of a ship that has, against real odds, survived its night, and somewhere below, Josiah Barlow finally lies down in the same hammock he rolled up 8 hours earlier, and sleeps the particular flat, dreamless sleep of a man who has spent everything his body had to spend. 3 months later, on a warmer night in a different stretch of Bahamian water, you are considerably better at this than you were. That's the strange truth about surviving one-night chase. It doesn't make the next one less dangerous, but it makes you less useless in the middle of it. And by now you can find your position at a halyard in the dark without needing to be told twice. Barlow has changed too, in ways that are harder to put a number on. 6 weeks a forced man turned into 6 months a working hand. And while nobody would claim he loves this life, he has, by simple necessity, become good at it. Good enough that when the sailing master calls for a man who can read water in poor light, it is increasingly often Barlow's name that gets called. Reading water in the dark is not a skill that gets written about nearly as often as swordplay or cannon fire, but it is, on a night like tonight, worth considerably more than either. The primary tool for it is almost embarrassingly simple. A lead line, a length of rope marked at measured intervals, a fathom being 6 feet, with a lead weight at the end. Its hollowed base packed with tallow so that whatever sits on the seabed will stick to it and come back up for inspection. A man stationed at the bow swings the lead forward, lets it sink, and calls back the depth in fathoms the moment the line goes slack against the bottom, over and over, in a rhythm that has to stay steady even as the ship moves and the water underneath it changes by the second.
Tonight, with a Bahamian patrol sloop somewhere astern and gaining, that call, by the mark, 3.5. 3.
Quarter less 3 is one of the only pieces of hard information anyone aboard actually has about the invisible ground rushing past beneath the hull, and the difference between 3 fathoms and quarter less 3 is the difference between 18 feet of clearance and considerably less than that, which on a night like tonight is the difference between escape and disaster. Barlow, tonight, isn't on the lead line, that's another man's post, but he's stationed near the bow all the same, watching the water itself rather than sounding it, because there's a second, older, less mathematical way of reading shallow ground that a sailmaker's mate turned forced hand has apparently picked up simply from months of paying close attention. The colour and texture of moving water changes over a shoal, paler and flatter where the bottom rises close beneath the surface, darker and more restless where it drops away into real depth, and a sharp eye, even by starlight, can sometimes catch that change a crucial few seconds before the lead line confirms it. It's not a skill anyone formally taught him, it's a skill 6 months of forced service handed him anyway. The way any job eventually teaches you its unwritten rules whether you wanted to learn them or not, and tonight, for the first time since he was taken off that Bristol snow, it might be the very thing that keeps this crew off a reef. The ship chasing you tonight isn't the Rose or anything like her, it's a smaller, faster sloop out of Nassau. One of the vessels Woodes Rogers armed and commissioned specifically to hunt pirates who hadn't taken the pardon, crewed in no small part by men who a year earlier might have been standing exactly where you're standing now. That's one of the stranger, less comfortable truths of this whole era. The line between hunter and hunted in these waters wasn't fixed. It was a matter of which side of a pardon deadline a man happened to land on, and the sloop closing on you tonight may well be commanded by someone who knew half your crew personally before he decided, for whatever mix of fear and practicality moved him, to take the king's mercy instead of running from it. Your captain makes for a cut between 2 low mangrove-fringed quays that he's used before, a passage narrow enough and shallow enough in places that a pursuing vessel unfamiliar with its exact contours would be taking a genuine risk to follow you into it at speed, in the dark, without a lead line of her own working constantly. This is local knowledge in its purest, most literal form, not a chart, because good charts of these particular channels barely existed in any reliable form in 1718, but the accumulated, unwritten memory of a captain and crew who had sailed this water enough times to carry its shape in their heads. Somewhere behind you, the pursuing sloop's captain has a genuine decision to make, and it's not a comfortable one. Press the chase into water he may not know as well as you do, or hold back and lose you in the dark rather than risk his own hull and his own men on a gamble he can't be certain will pay off. More often than the Crown would have liked, in exactly this kind of moment, caution won. It's worth pausing, in the middle of this run, to explain why a ship's speed on a night like tonight depends on more than just wind and rigging, because the condition of the hull itself, invisible below the waterline, could be worth more knots than any amount of skilled sail handling above it. Left alone, a wooden hull in warm tropical water accumulates barnacles, weed, and the borrowing damage of a shipworm called Teredo navalis with startling speed, and a badly fouled bottom could slow a vessel by a third or more within a matter of months. This is why pirate crews, whenever they found a stretch of safe hidden shore, went through the laborious, unglamorous process of careening, deliberately running the ship up onto a beach at high tide then. As the tide dropped, heaving her over onto her side using block and tackle rigged to her own masts, to expose the hull for scraping and burning clean, and, if needed, recalking and repair. It could take the better part of a week, left a crew completely vulnerable and unarmed on an open beach for the duration, and was, despite all of that risk, considered essential often enough that captains scheduled their entire cruising patterns around finding safe careening ground every few months. Your ship was careened 5 weeks ago, on a deserted quay 2 days' sail from here, and every extra knot that Clean Hull is giving you tonight is the direct physical payoff of a week the whole crew spent exposed and unarmed on a beach, betting that no one would find you before the work was done. The quays themselves, threading past on either side as you run, aren't the picture postcard islands a modern eye might imagine from the word Bahamas. Most of them, at this scale and this proximity, are low, tangled walls of mangrove root and thin sand, offering no real shelter and considerably more insect life than comfort. A cloud of mosquitoes finds the ship somewhere in the shallows and stays with you for the better part of 20 minutes, and more than one man mutters something uncharitable about the trade-off between escaping a Royal Navy sloop and getting eaten alive doing it. It's a small, almost absurd counterpoint to the genuine danger of the night, and it does the job small absurdities always do on a frightened crew. It gives you something to complain about that isn't the actual thing you're afraid of, and complaining about something safe to complain about turns out to be its own modest practical comfort. The gamble tonight pays off the way it usually has. These last 3 months, the pursuing sloop falls back at the mouth of the cut, her captain apparently unwilling to follow you into water he can't be sure of, and by the time the sky starts to lighten again, You've put enough distance and enough shoal ground between yourself and Nassau's patrol that the immediate danger has passed. Barlow, still near the bow, finally sits down against a coil of rope. And for a moment nobody says anything at all. The particular silence of men who've just done something dangerous well enough that it worked. Then someone, the same weathered man with the missing fingers from the last chase, mutters something about how this is getting to be a habit, and a few tired men actually laugh, quietly, the kind of laugh that's mostly relief wearing a joke's clothing. What made nights like this one survivable, again and again, across the messy back half of 1718, wasn't only the skill of any one crew. It was a whole informal economy of complicity scattered across these islands. Bahamian settlers and free black wreckers and small boat traders who, whatever the Crown's official position on piracy happened to be that month, still traded provisions, fresh water. And exactly the kind of local channel knowledge you've just watched save this ship, in exchange for a fair price and no questions asked. Piracy in the Bahamas in this era wasn't simply a matter of a few outlaw crews against the world. It was propped up, quietly and unofficially, by an entire regional network of people with their own reasons, economic, personal. Sometimes simply the plain human instinct not to turn in a familiar face, for not being especially eager to help the Navy succeed. That network is a large part of why a campaign as well funded and well organised as Rogers's still took years, not months, to finally close down every last hiding place these waters had to offer. It wasn't a clean run the whole way through the cut, either, and it's worth being honest about the moment it nearly wasn't a run at all. Partway through the passage, the leadman's call comes back sharper than anyone wants to hear, and a half, 2, barely 12 feet of water under a hull that draws close to 7, and for 3 or 4 of the longest seconds of the whole night. Every man near the bow braces without quite meaning to, waiting for the grinding shudder of keel meeting sand that would end this chase far more decisively than any cannon shot. It doesn't come. The captain, already turning the helm before the second call even finishes, eases the ship a half point off her line, and the next sounding comes back deeper. The immediate danger sliding past beneath you in the dark, exactly as fast as it arrived. Nobody talks about it afterward beyond a few clipped words between the helmsman and the sailing master. There isn't time to be shaken by a thing that didn't happen. Not tonight. But you notice your own hands are less steady on the line than they were a minute ago. And that unsteadiness doesn't fully leave you until well after the sky starts to lighten. The specific water you're running tonight has names, even if half the men currently sailing through it in the dark couldn't have told you them a year ago. Passages like the ones threading between the Berry Islands, or the long reef-guarded approach into Exuma Sound further south, were exactly the kind of ground that made this whole stretch of the Bahamas so valuable to pirate crews and so hazardous to the deeper draft ships hunting them. Dozens of miles of scattered cays, coral heads, and shifting sandbars that could swallow a careless keel in minutes. All of it barely charted by any reliable English survey until decades after tonight. A pirate crew that had spent real time in these waters carried in effect a chart that didn't exist anywhere on paper, built entirely from repeated passage and hard-won memory. And that unwritten chart was worth more to your survival tonight than any weapon stowed below decks. None of that memory would have been much use without provisions to keep a crew fed and watered long enough to use it. And this is where the quieter, less romantic side of the Bahamian pirate economy did its most essential work. Small settlements scattered across these islands, some of English descent, some free black communities built up over years by escaped or freed men who had made their own uneasy peace with a hard, marginal coastline the Crown mostly ignored, routinely traded fresh water, salt fish, and turtle meat to passing crews willing to pay a fair price in stolen coin. No questions asked about where the coin, or the crew, had come from. It was not universal goodwill. Plenty of islanders wanted nothing to do with pirates, and said so plainly when asked, and some traded out of simple fear rather than sympathy. But enough of that quiet, transactional cooperation existed, spread across enough scattered anchorages, that a crew willing to pay and polite enough not to make trouble could reliably restock and keep moving for months at a stretch, without ever coming near a proper, government-controlled port at all. It is one more piece of the honest picture behind tonight's escape. You didn't outrun the Royal Navy alone. You outran it with the quiet, paid-for help of people who had their own reasons, personal and economic both, for not being in any particular hurry to see you caught. It's worth sitting for a moment with what 3 months of successful escapes like this one actually meant in the wider arithmetic of a pirate's life in 1718, because the honest numbers are sobering in a way the excitement of any single chase can make easy to forget. Historians who have studied the surviving trial and mortality records of the Golden Age generally describe an active pirate's career, once it began in earnest, as strikingly short, commonly estimated at somewhere around 2 years on average, before a man was killed, captured, or occasionally managed to retire quietly, with his winnings intact. A fate that befell only a small minority. Measured against that grim average, every clean run through a shoal like the one you've just survived is not simply an exciting escape. It's a small, temporary victory against odds that were, by any honest reckoning, stacked heavily against everyone currently standing on this deck. Barlow, forced into this life against his own will 6 months ago, has already outlasted a meaningful share of the men who chose it freely. That's not comfort, exactly, but it isn't nothing either, and on a night like tonight, with dawn coming up gold over water you didn't wreck yourself in, it's enough to let a tired crew allow itself something close to quiet satisfaction before the next alarm, whenever it comes, starts the whole calculation over again. Steering a course through any of this in the dark required one more skill worth naming plainly, because it's easy to assume a chase like tonight's was purely a matter of instinct and nerve, when a real portion of it was quiet, careful technical work. With no reliable shore lights and no lit channel markers anywhere in these waters in 1718, a helmsman running at night leaned heavily on the stars themselves to hold a course, Polaris, the North Star, sitting close enough to true north that a steady eye could use it to check a heading without needing to consult a compass by lantern light every few minutes. A lantern that would, in any case, have ruined every man's night vision the moment it was uncovered. Sailing masters of this era were expected to know the sky in something close to the same intimate detail a modern driver knows of familiar commute, tracking not just Polaris, but the rising and setting points of other bright recognizable stars across the season, building a mental map of the heavens to match the mental map of the water below it. Get either map wrong on a night like tonight, with a hostile sloop somewhere behind you and shoal water somewhere ahead, and the consequences arrived considerably faster than they would have on a calm daylight passage, with room to correct a mistake. This is, in its own quiet way, one of the more remarkable and least celebrated skills a pirate crew of this era actually needed to survive. Not swordsmanship, not gunnery, but the patient, unglamorous literacy of stars and soundings that turned an impossible run through invisible shoals into something merely very dangerous instead. There is a kind of quiet pride that settles over a crew that has run this particular gauntlet enough times to start trusting its own competence, and it showed, in small ways, in how the deck settled once the immediate danger had passed. Men who had cursed and shoved their way up a companionway ladder in blind panic 3 months ago now moved to their stations with something closer to grim. Practiced efficiency, and even the newest hands aboard had picked up enough of the rhythm to know which rope to grab without being told twice. Barlow, for his part, still didn't call this ship home, and likely never fully would. The record of forced men who testified later at their own Admiralty trials makes clear that plenty of them counted the days until some chance at escape or rescue presented itself, whatever competence they'd built in the meantime. But competence and belonging aren't the same thing, and a man could hold both a genuine wish to be free of this life and a genuine, hard-earned skill at surviving it, without those two truths cancelling each other out. That contradiction, skilled and unwilling both at once, sat on this ship every bit as much as the rats did, and it would matter again, later, in ways nobody standing at the rail this particular dawn could have predicted. Not every hiding place stayed hidden forever, though, and not every ship running these channels was armed only with cannon and courage. Some of them relied on something considerably older and, in its own way, just as effective, a flag, run up at exactly the right moment, that could end a chase before it ever really began. Some ships never got the chance to run at all, because by the time they understood what they were looking at, the chase was already over. The lookout aboard a small merchant sloop working the passage between Hispaniola and the Bahamas one afternoon in 1718 saw the strange sail on the horizon well before it drew close enough to worry about, and for a while it worried him only in the ordinary professional way any unfamiliar ship worried a merchant captain in these waters. She closed the distance steadily, flying as she came, an English flag entirely unremarkable in itself. Dozens of vessels crossed this stretch of sea under English colours every week, and there was nothing in the sight of one more to raise an alarm. It was only when she came within hailing distance, close enough now that turning to run would have meant certain capture anyway, that the English colours came down and something else went up in their place, a plain black flag, and beneath it, close enough behind, that the two arrived almost as one signal. A second flag, blood red, snapping hard in the wind. The merchant captain, according to the kind of deposition that survives from encounters exactly like this one, understood immediately and completely what he was looking at, and gave the order to strike his own colours without a shot being fired on either side. This is the story of the Jolly Roger, not a single flag, but a system, a language flown in cloth, that could end a fight before it had properly begun, and that shaped the entire economics of piracy far more than any cannon ever did. The name itself has a murkier history than the flag's terrifying reputation might suggest, and it's worth being honest about how little is actually settled. The most common explanation traces Jolly Roger back to the French phrase joli rouge, meaning roughly pretty red, a nod to the plain red flags, sometimes called bloody flags, that privateers and, later, pirates had been flying as a no-quarter warning for generations before any skull and crossbones design entered the picture at all. A competing explanation points instead to Old Roger, a period nickname for the devil himself, which would make the flag's name a fairly on-the-nose bit of pirate branding. Both explanations appear in sources from the era and after, and neither can be confirmed with real certainty, which is itself a useful reminder that even something as visually iconic as this flag carries more legend than settled fact once you start pulling at the details. What can be said with more confidence is the timeline. The first clearly recorded use of a black flag bearing skull and bones imagery, specifically documented, belongs to a Breton pirate named Emmanuel Wynne, spotted flying a flag combining a skull, crossed bones, and an hourglass off the coast of Santiago in the year 1700, nearly 2 full decades before the night chase you spent the earlier part of tonight aboard. The actual mechanics of how these flags worked as a system are more interesting and more practically important than the imagery alone. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources describe a 2-stage signal that pirate captains used with real consistency across the Golden Age. The black flag went up first, as an initial warning, and it carried an implicit promise along with the threat, surrender now, and the crew would very likely be given quarter, meaning their lives would be spared even if their cargo was not. If that first warning went unheeded, and the targeted ship tried to run or fight instead of striking her colours, the black flag came down and a plain red flag went up in its place, and the red flag carried no such promise at all. It's worth flagging honestly, in the spirit of this whole project's caution around disputed pirate lore, that not every historian agrees on which colour meant which signal, or even that the 2-flag system was applied with perfect consistency across every crew and every captain of the era. Surviving accounts occasionally reverse the colours, or describe crews skipping straight to red without a black warning at all. What's not in dispute is the underlying function. Red, in every account, meant no quarter, meant the crew intended to fight to the finish and take no prisoners alive, and a merchant crew that saw red run up the mast understood, correctly, that their choices had just narrowed to fighting for their lives, or dying anyway. By the time your ship was running from the Rose earlier tonight, individual captains across the Caribbean had begun customizing this basic black and red vocabulary into flags distinctive enough to serve almost as a personal signature, a branding exercise as calculated, in its own violent way, as anything a modern business might spend real money designing. Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirate captains of the entire era, flew a flag depicting himself standing atop two skulls, with letters beneath reading Ab and Am, understood by most historians to stand for a Barbadian's head and a Martinican's head, a pointed personal grudge against the governors of those two islands who had specifically sent ships to hunt him. Christopher Moody, another captain active in these same waters around this same period, flew a striking red flag of his own featuring a winged hourglass and an arm brandishing a dagger, red from the start, no black warning offered at all. A design built to announce, before a single shot was fired, that this particular captain did not deal in half measures. Popular tradition also credits Blackbeard with a specific and now famous design, a horned skeleton spearing a bleeding heart while raising a toast, though it's worth noting, in keeping with the caution this whole story owes to Golden Age pirate lore generally, that the surviving evidence tying that specific image to Blackbeard himself during his own lifetime is considerably thinner than popular. Imagination assumes, and much of the flag's modern fame may owe more to later illustration and legend than to any contemporary eyewitness account. Flags did other quieter work too, well before any black or red cloth ever went up the mast, and this is where the story loops back to the flying gang and the waters around Nassau you've already spent time in tonight. Flying false colours, running up the flag of a friendly or neutral nation to disguise a ship's true intentions and true crew until the last possible moment, was, remarkably, standard and broadly accepted maritime practice across the entire Atlantic world in this period, used routinely by legitimate naval vessels and merchant ships alike as a simple ruse of war or commerce, only becoming a punishable deception once a ship actually opened fire under a false flag rather than her own. Pirates exploited this shared pre-existing custom shamelessly, closing on unsuspecting prey under English or Dutch or French colours precisely as the merchant sloop's lookout described, and holding that disguise right up until the range had closed to nothing and running was no longer a realistic option. It meant that the sight of an approaching ship, in these waters, in this year, told a wary captain almost nothing certain about who was actually aboard her. Only the moment the true flag went up did the truth arrive, and by then, more often than not, it arrived too late to matter. There is a genuine, if uncomfortable, argument to be made that this whole terrifying signalling system actually reduced the overall bloodshed of the Golden Age, rather than increasing it. And it's worth sitting with that argument rather than dismissing it purely because it sounds counterintuitive. A merchant crew that recognised the black flag early and struck their colours without a fight typically walked away from the encounter with their lives, their ship stripped of cargo but their bodies unharmed. A far better outcome, from any sailor's perspective, than a prolonged fight against a better armed, more numerous pirate crew that both sides understood the merchantmen were very likely to lose regardless. The flag's terror was, in this sense, doing genuine persuasive work rather than purely decorative work. It was a threat specifically engineered to make violence unnecessary by making surrender look like the obviously rational choice. And it succeeded often enough that most pirate captures of this era, by the surviving record, involved little or no actual combat at all. This doesn't make the system humane, exactly. The threat behind it was entirely real. And crews that called the bluff sometimes paid for it in exactly the terms the red flag promised. But it's a more complicated, more genuinely strategic piece of psychological warfare than the simple image of a skull and crossbones tends to suggest. It's worth returning to Emmanuel Wynn's 1700 encounter off Santiago for a moment longer, because the fuller account of it, as it survives, tells us something useful about how genuinely novel that flag still was at the turn of the century, less than 2 decades before your own ship was running from the Rose. Wynne, a Breton privateer turned pirate operating in Caribbean waters, engaged a small English man of war and, according to the account preserved in the historical record, flew a black flag bearing a skull, crossed bones and an hourglass, the hourglass appointed edition, meant to communicate that time for the target ship to surrender was actively, visibly running out. The English vessel's own report of the encounter is one of the earliest known documents to describe this specific combination of imagery in any detail, which is precisely why historians treat Wynn's flag as something close to a founding design, the ancestor from which most of the more famous Golden Age variations descended over the following 2 decades. By 1718, in other words, the flag you might have glimpsed at a distance from your own ship's deck was already a design with real history behind it, refined and personalised by nearly 20 years of captains borrowing, altering, and one-upping whatever their predecessors had already flown. The choice to fly a no-quarter red flag was not, it's worth understanding, a decision without consequences for the pirates themselves, even in the moment of apparent victory. Admiralty courts trying captured pirate crews in this period paid close attention to exactly this kind of evidence, and a red flag flown during a captured prize's taking could be entered into testimony as clear proof of premeditated intent to commit violence beyond the ordinary business of robbery, a detail that could weigh heavily against a defendant already fighting for his life in front of a court with little patience for nuance. Forced men like Barlow in particular depended enormously on witnesses willing to testify that they had taken no active part in raising such a flag or pressing such an attack, since simple presence aboard a ship that had flown the red flag and fought under it could be treated by a hostile court as evidence enough of willing participation on its own. The flag, in other words, cut in 2 directions at once: a weapon against the ship it was raised against, and later, potential evidence against the very crew that had raised it, in a courtroom neither side could see coming on the night the cloth first went up the mast. Somebody, of course, actually had to make these flags, and it's a detail easy to skip past in favour of the imagery itself. Pirate ships did not carry a professionally printed banner ordered from some maritime outfitter. A captain's flag was, in nearly every documented case, hand-sewn aboard ship from whatever cloth was available: sailcloth, captured bunting, sometimes a woman's dress or a merchant's bolt of fabric taken from a prize's hold and repurposed with considerably less ceremony than its original owner likely intended. That work fell, naturally enough, to whichever hand aboard had a sailmaker's skill with a needle and palm, precisely the kind of skill Josiah Barlow, forced off the Bristol snow, brought aboard his own ship months before tonight's chase ever began. It's not documented that Barlow himself ever stitched a Jolly Roger, his own crew, running quietly rather than flying colours of terror. May never have needed one at all. But somewhere in these same waters, in this same year, some other forced sailmaker, with exactly Barlow's skills and very possibly exactly Barlow's resentments, sat below decks with a needle in his hand, stitching together the exact image meant to terrify the next ship his own captain chose to hunt. A small, strange irony worth sitting with for a moment before we move on. What survives in the record from the other side of that flag, from the merchant sailors staring up at it rather than the pirates hoisting it, is worth hearing too. Because the fear it describes wasn't abstract or literary. It was specific and physical and preserved in exactly the kind of dry legal paperwork that makes this whole era so much better documented than its swashbuckling reputation suggests. Depositions taken from captured merchant crews across the Caribbean and American coast in this period describe, again and again, the same handful of physical details: a captain's hands shaking as he gave the order to strike his own colours, a crew going silent almost in unison the moment the black cloth caught the wind and unfurled fully enough to show its design. Men who had been arguing moments earlier about cargo or wages suddenly finding nothing at all worth saying. One deposition from a captured trading vessel, taken down by a colonial official investigating a piracy case later that same year, describes the ship's mate as having gone, in the clerk's own paraphrase, entirely white in the face and unable to give a coherent order for several minutes after the flag went up. Not embellishment for a courtroom's benefit, but the kind of mundane, almost embarrassing physical detail that tends to show up in honest testimony precisely because nobody thought to invent it. Fear like that doesn't announce itself with speeches. It shows up in trembling hands and swallowed words, and the men who wrote these depositions down, weeks or months after the fact, were still, in their own halting way, describing exactly what that felt like. It's worth remembering too that this fear didn't require an actual fight to be entirely justified. The overwhelming majority of ships that saw a black or red flag raised against them never fired a shot in their own defence at all. Striking colours immediately was, by a wide margin, the statistically safer choice, and merchant crews across the Caribbean understood that calculation as well as any pirate captain did. Which means that for most of the men who ever stared up at a Jolly Roger in genuine terror, the story ended not in cannon fire and boarding pikes, but in a strange anticlimactic kind of relief. Robbed, frightened, sometimes roughed up or held briefly for information, but alive, watching a pirate crew strip their hold and sail away, the black flag coming back down almost as quickly as it had gone up, its work for that particular afternoon already done. That, more than any battle scene, was the true, ordinary experience of the Jolly Roger for most of the people who ever encountered it, not a fight, but a threat so completely credible that the fight never needed to happen at all. Flags did one more piece of quiet, practical work that had nothing to do with terrifying strangers at all. They let pirates recognise each other. In a world without radio, without any reliable way to confirm a distant ship's loyalties before drawing within hailing range, a captain's personalised flag design functioned almost like a signature on a letter, letting an allied or simply acquainted crew identify a friendly vessel on the horizon long before any hail could be exchanged. Crews that had careened together, traded provisions together, or simply drunk together in Nassau's taverns during the loose, ungoverned years of the Flying Gang, learned to recognise one another's colours at a distance, and that recognition mattered in practical terms. It was the difference between two pirate crews joining forces against a common target and two pirate crews nearly firing on each other by mistake in poor visibility. A mistake that, however farcical it sounds today, carried entirely real and fatal consequences at the time. The flag, in other words, was never only a weapon aimed outward. It was also a kind of identity, stitched by hand, flown with intention, and recognised by exactly the community of men most likely to need to recognise it. There's a reason black, specifically, became the dominant colour of this whole visual language beyond simple visibility against a bright sky, and it's worth a moment's thought because the symbolism wasn't accidental. Black cloth, in the broader maritime and civic culture of the British Atlantic world, already carried strong associations with mourning and death, well before any pirate ever ran a skull-marked version of it up a mast. Funeral processions, memorial banners, and mourning dress all drew on the same sombre colour, and a pirate crew flying black was in effect. Borrowing a visual vocabulary its intended audience already understood instinctively, without needing a moment's explanation. A merchant sailor who had never once encountered a pirate flag before in his life could still read the basic message correctly the first time he saw one, because the colour itself was already doing half the communicating before the skull and bones ever came into focus. It's a small piece of evidence for just how deliberately these signals were built, borrowing meaning that already lived in the culture, rather than inventing something from nothing. This is the story of the Jolly Roger then, not one flag but a whole evolving vocabulary of cloth and colour, that turned a piece of fabric into one of the most effective weapons any pirate crew of this era possessed, more reliable at ending a fight quickly than a broadside ever was. What's happened to that same image in the 3 centuries since is its own small, strange postscript. The flag that once meant, with total sincerity, imminent and possibly fatal violence, has been sanded down by time into a cheerful commercial shorthand, printed on children's bedsheets, stitched onto amusement park costumes, flown from novelty flagpoles at seaside restaurants that serve nothing more dangerous than fried shrimp. Somewhere in that long journey from genuine terror to birthday party decoration, the actual stakes of the thing got lost, and it's worth remembering, on a night like tonight, that the men who first ran that flag up a mast meant every bit of what it promised. Not every ship that saw a black flag rise against it lived comfortably ever after, and not every crew that flew one escaped the reckoning waiting on the other side of a lost chase. What happened once the running and the hiding and every flag in the locker finally ran out of road is where tonight's journey turns next. Back to the deck you started this whole night standing on, and to the price some of these men actually paid. Nearly a year after the first night you spent running from the Rose, on a humid morning in the late summer of 1719, your luck, and Josiah Barlow's, and the luck of every man still aboard that sloop, finally ran out entirely. It didn't happen the way you might have imagined it would, back on that first frightened night. There was no dramatic broadside, no desperate last stand with cutlasses drawn against overwhelming odds. What happened instead was smaller, and in its own way worse. Your ship, running for a familiar cut in unfamiliar conditions after a fresh storm had shifted the sandbars just enough to matter, ran hard aground on a shoal that had been open water only weeks before. There was no working her free before a Navy sloop, alerted days earlier by exactly the kind of informant network you learned about a few chapters back, came around the point and found you sitting helpless, canvas slack, hull tilted at an angle that made resistance look less like defiance and more like a slow, undignified way to get everyone aboard killed for nothing. Your captain, weighing the situation with a clarity that had kept this crew alive through a dozen close calls already, gave the order to strike colours rather than fight a battle nobody on this deck could win from a grounded hull. It is worth pausing on how anticlimactic that decision felt in the moment, not the thunderous final battle of legend, but a quiet, practical surrender to physics and bad timing, the kind of ending that never makes it into the songs but happened, by the actual surviving record, to a considerable number of pirate crews across this entire era. Being boarded by the men who have spent the better part of a year hunting you is its own strange, disorienting experience, and it doesn't unfold the way fear had led you to expect. There's no immediate violence. Navy boarding parties in this period operated under fairly strict procedure, in no small part because a captured pirate crew represented potential bounty money and useful testimony, both of which were worth considerably more alive and cooperative than dead out of spite. You're searched, disarmed, and your hands are bound with rope rather than iron at first. The irons, heavier and more permanent, wait for the transfer to a proper holding facility on shore. A Navy lieutenant, young and clearly aware of the significance of the capture he's just made, moves through your crew taking names, and you watch him write Josiah Barlow in a small ledger with the same flat procedural indifference he's shown every other name so far. He has no way yet of knowing that name matters differently than the others. That distinction, if it comes at all, is going to be made later by people considerably more interested in the details of Barlow's specific case than this exhausted young officer currently has time to be. The weeks that follow are, in their own quiet way, harder to endure than the chase itself ever was. You and the rest of the surviving crew are held in a cramped, fetid holding space on shore, sometimes a proper jail, sometimes simply the hold of a moored prison ship, depending on which port your capture happened to land you in, awaiting an Admiralty court session that could be convened within days, or could, depending on circumstance, take months to actually assemble. This waiting is its own particular form of suffering, one rarely given its due in the more exciting parts of pirate history. No chase to occupy your hands, no rope to haul, nothing to do but sit in irons in the heat and turn over, again and again, exactly how much your own testimony is going to matter once the court finally convenes. Some men in your position pass the waiting in a kind of numb resignation. Others, according to surviving accounts of exactly this situation, spend it composing the confession and repentant speech condemned pirates were generally expected to deliver from the gallows, not because they expected mercy from delivering it, but because it was, in a strange way, the last piece of the story still fully within their own control. When the trial finally comes, it moves considerably faster than you'd expect given how much hinges on it. Admiralty courts trying piracy cases in this era, especially in busy years like 1719 when captures were coming in steadily across multiple colonies, could move through the testimony, verdict and sentencing of a dozen or more men in the span of a few days, sometimes less. The court's central question for each man individually, because it was, at least in principle, decided man by man rather than as a single verdict for the whole crew, was simple to state and considerably harder to actually prove. Had this particular defendant joined the pirate crew willingly, taken a voluntary share of plunder? and fought against the king's ships or the king's subjects by his own free choice? Or had he been forced aboard against his will and kept there under threat, contributing only what he had no real power to refuse? This is where Josiah Barlow's story reaches the moment that has been building, in small ways, across the entire length of tonight's journey. Barlow's case for having been forced rested on exactly the kind of evidence Admiralty courts of this period took seriously when it was available. Witnesses, 2 men from the crew, both facing their own trials and their own considerable risk in speaking up at all, testified that Barlow had been taken directly off the Bristol snow against his will, had never signed the articles under anything resembling free consent, had drawn no voluntary share of any prize taken, and had, on more than one occasion, spoken openly among the crew of his wish to be free of the ship the first honest chance he got. The court also heard, because this detail had in fact been noted and preserved exactly as the quartermaster promised it would be, back on that first frantic night of running, that Barlow's only recorded actions aboard ship involved sail repair and, later, water reading during shoal navigation, tasks the court's own reasoning accepted as consistent with a forced man contributing skilled labour under duress, rather than a willing pirate contributing to acts of violence or robbery. We know these specific details not because they survive in some dramatised second-hand pirate biography, but because Admiralty trial records of exactly this kind survive in genuine colonial archives, preserving testimony, verdict and sentence with a bureaucratic thoroughness that makes for dry reading and, precisely because of that dryness, considerably more trustworthy history than the embellished popular accounts written for entertainment rather than the court record. It is worth being honest, in the same breath, that not every forced man's case went as cleanly as this one. Surviving trial records from across the era also include forced men convicted and hanged anyway, when no willing witness stepped forward on their behalf, or when a court, weighing a heavy caseload and public pressure to demonstrate results, simply chose not to extend the benefit of the doubt. Barlow's outcome was not guaranteed by the mere fact of his forcing. It depended, in the end, on 2 other frightened men choosing, at real risk to themselves, to tell the truth on his behalf. The holding cell itself deserves its own honest description, because the suffering of awaiting trial was its own distinct ordeal, separate from anything the chase or the capture had already put you through. You're held with perhaps 30 other men in a space built for considerably fewer, the heat of a Caribbean summer, trapped and thickened by too many bodies and too little air moving through whatever narrow windows or gratings the building allows. The irons themselves, heavier now than the simple rope binding from the moment of capture, chafe raw patches into wrists and ankles within days. And the guards assigned to watch you are, by every account surviving from prisoners held in exactly this situation, indifferent at best to complaints about the wounds the iron leaves behind. Food arrives irregularly, and in quantities calculated for survival rather than comfort. You sleep when you sleep at all, sitting upright against a wall shared with 24 other men doing the same, and the particular grinding boredom of it, nothing to do, nowhere to go, no work to occupy your hands the way sail repair or lead line soundings once did, turns out to be its own specific kind of misery that the open chase, for all its terror, never actually inflicted on you. Fear that has nowhere to go and nothing to do eventually curdles into something closer to despair, and more than one prisoner held in circumstances exactly like this one, according to surviving colonial records, did not live to see his own trial date at all, felled instead by the fevers and dysentery that spread easily through crowded, poorly ventilated holding cells in tropical heat. Peter Coyle, the genuine volunteer you met briefly back on that first chase night, the corkman who'd signed the articles freely after watching his old merchant captain flog a boy nearly to death, stood trial 2 days before you did, in the same crowded courtroom, before the same panel of judges. His case was, in the court's own reasoning, considerably more straightforward than Barlow's. Coyle had signed willingly, taken a full share of at least 2 prizes by his own admission, and had, by the testimony of a captured merchant sailor from an earlier encounter, fired a swivel gun during a resisted boarding some months back. There was no forcing to argue, no coercion to document. nothing in his record for a sympathetic witness to point to. Coyle did not deny any of it when his turn came to speak, and it's worth noting, in the spirit of the honest record this account tries to hold to, that a number of surviving pirate trial transcripts from this era describe exactly this kind of plain, unadorned admission from defendants who seem to have understood. By the time they reached the dock, that denial would serve them no better than honesty, and might serve them considerably worse in the court's eyes. Coyle was convicted and sentenced to hang alongside 4 other men from your crew, all of them men you'd hauled rope beside, eaten salt pork beside, sweated through careening beside on some forgotten beach months earlier. You do not get to say goodbye to him in any way that resembles ceremony. You simply see him one final time, being led out under guard on the morning appointed for the sentence to be carried out, and then you don't see him again at all. It's worth grounding Barlow's specific outcome against the wider pattern of how these forced man cases actually played out across the era. Because his case, while individual, was not unique in its shape. The trials of Blackbeard's own captured crew, held in Virginia in the spring of 1719 after the battle at Ocracoke you're about to hear the fuller story of, followed a strikingly similar pattern. Of the men taken alive, several who could produce credible testimony of having been forced aboard against their will were acquitted outright, while others, convicted on clearer evidence of willing participation, were hanged at what is now Hampton, Virginia, within weeks of their trial's conclusion. The pattern held again and again across these years, in courtroom after courtroom, colony after colony, genuine mercy available, genuinely extended, to men who could prove they'd never had a real choice, and genuine, swift severity for everyone the court judged to have made that choice freely. It is, in its narrow and imperfect way, a more careful system than popular memory of Golden Age piracy usually credits it with being. It was also, in the same breath, a system that hanged men by the dozen within a single spring, and both of those things were true at once, in the same courtrooms, under the same law. There is one more piece of this chapter worth telling honestly, and it belongs to you rather than to Barlow or Coyle, because your own case, as it happened, fell somewhere between theirs. You had not been forced aboard the way Barlow was. You'd made your own choice, back before any of tonight's chases began, for reasons that felt sound at the time and considerably less sound now. Sitting in irons waiting for a verdict, but you also hadn't fired a gun in anger, hadn't taken more than a small ordinary share of any prize, and when your turn at the dock finally came, the court weighed your case for what felt like a very long time, and settled, in the end, not on the gallows but on transportation. A sentence common enough in this era for pirates whose guilt was real, but whose conduct hadn't risen to the level the court reserved for hanging, shipping convicted men off to indentured labour in one of the colonies for a term of years rather than ending their lives outright. It is not freedom, it is not mercy in any generous sense of the word, but it is, when set against what happened to Coyle 2 days before your own trial, the difference between a hard, unchosen future and no future at all. And on the morning they read your sentence aloud, that difference was the only thing in the world you could bring yourself to feel grateful for. It's worth pausing too on the men doing the judging, because it would be too simple to picture the court as a faceless machine feeling nothing at all about the men passing through it. Colonial judges presiding over piracy trials in this period were, by the nature of small colonial society, often personally familiar with the shipping losses these very crews had caused. A judge's own brother-in-law's cargo taken, a judge's own neighbour's ship burned or stripped. The resentment personal rather than abstract in a way that surely shaped, at least at the margins, how much patience the bench extended to a nervous, half-coherent forced man trying to explain himself in front of them. And yet the same surviving records show judges in more than one colony extending exactly that patience anyway, weighing testimony carefully, asking pointed questions of witnesses rather than simply rubber-stamping a guilty verdict for every man who'd ever set foot on a pirate deck. It doesn't erase the brutality of what happened to Coyle and the others, but it complicates the easy image of these courts as nothing more than a hanging machine running on autopilot, and complication, more often than not, is closer to the truth than the simpler story would have you believe. The court found Josiah Barlow not guilty of piracy on the strength of that testimony and ordered his release, though release in practice meant something considerably less triumphant than the word suggests. A freed forced man in this period typically had no money, no ship, no easy way home, and often found himself pressured, gently or otherwise, into signing aboard whatever legitimate vessel happened to need hands and happened to be sailing in a useful direction, sometimes a merchantman bound back toward England. Sometimes. In a final irony that surviving records confirm happened to more than one acquitted forced man of this era, a Royal Navy vessel glad to take on an experienced hand regardless of how he'd come by his experience. What became of Barlow specifically past this point isn't preserved in any record this account can point to with confidence, and in the spirit of the honesty this whole story owes its listeners, it's better to say so plainly than to invent a tidy ending for a man the historical record simply lets go. Not every man from your crew was so fortunate, and it would be its own kind of dishonesty to end this chapter without saying so directly. The court found a number of your former shipmates guilty, men who had signed the articles freely, taken willing shares, and fought when fighting was called for, exactly the choices the law held them responsible for, regardless of how understandable those choices had felt on the nights you made them together. Their sentence, as it was for the overwhelming majority of convicted pirates across this entire era, was death by hanging. Carried out publicly at the harbour's edge within days of the verdict, the bodies left visible for a time afterward as the same grim, practical warning you already saw at work in Nassau, back at the very start of tonight's journey. We won't linger on the details of that morning. Some things are better left at the edge of the telling than walked through step by step, and the weight of it doesn't need embellishing to land. What's worth carrying forward from this chapter, instead, is the strange, incomplete justice of the system these men actually lived and died under. A system considerably more attentive to the specific circumstances of an individual forced man's case than a modern reader might expect from an era known mostly for its casual brutality, and yet a system that still, in the same breath, hanged men within days of a trial for choices that on plenty of those nights had felt considerably less free than the law was willing to acknowledge. Barlow's survival and his shipmates' deaths came out of the same court, under the same law, decided by the same handful of men on the bench, and the difference between the two outcomes came down, in the end, to something as fragile and human as whether two frightened crewmates chose to speak up for him when it would have been easier and safer to stay silent. That's not a clean moral, it's just what actually happened, as close as the record lets us get to it. And it's worth remembering too that the same articles which once promised Thomas Pruitt compensation for his crushed fingers, and which gave every man aboard a vote in choosing who commanded them, offered absolutely nothing once a Crown Court took over the deciding. The two systems, the crew's own rough, negotiated fairness, and the Crown's formal, occasionally merciful, more often lethal law, never once overlapped, and men who had lived under the first found themselves, in the space of a single bad morning aground on a shifted sandbar, entirely at the mercy of the second instead. Not every pirate captured in these years faced a quiet Admiralty courtroom at all, though some went down fighting, in the open, with the whole weight of a colony's fear and fascination bearing down on a single stretch of shallow water. And the most famous of those final stands was still to come, just a few months further into that same violent year. That final stand, when it came, took place in a shallow North Carolina inlet at first light, against a man who had spent 2 years building the single most terrifying reputation of the entire Golden Age, and who, when the moment actually arrived, chose to meet it exactly the way he'd built that reputation in the first place, loudly, defiantly, and without the slightest interest in surrender. At daybreak on the 22nd of November 1718, 2 small hired sloops named Ranger and Jane worked their way into the shallow, sandbar-choked waters of Ocracoke Inlet, off the coast of what is now North Carolina. Carrying a combined company of 57 Royal Navy sailors and Marines under the command of a young lieutenant named Robert Maynard. Anchored ahead of them, aboard his own sloop Adventure with a crew reduced to somewhere around 19 men, was Edward Teach, Blackbeard, nursing what was almost certainly the tail end of a hard night's drinking. Having spent the previous evening entertaining guests aboard his ship in a mood one contemporary account describes as celebratory, as though the pirate believed himself, for the moment, entirely safe. He was wrong, and by the time his own lookouts spotted the two sloops closing at dawn, there was very little time left to do anything about it beyond preparing to fight. Understanding how Blackbeard came to be sitting in that particular inlet, that particular morning, requires stepping back through roughly 2 years of a career built, in large part on image rather than raw violence, an unusual claim to make about the most feared pirate of his age, but one the surviving record actually supports. Edward Teach, born somewhere around 1680, likely in or near Bristol, England, appears to have served as a privateer during the War of the Spanish Succession, before drifting, sometime around 1716, into the crew of Benjamin Hornigold, the same pirate captain who would later take Woodes Rogers's pardon and turn pirate hunter himself. Under Hornigold's tutelage, Teach rose quickly, and by 1717 he had his own command, built around a captured French slave ship originally named La Concorde, which he rammed with as many as 40 guns, and renamed Queen Anne's Revenge, instantly one of the most powerful vessels flying under any pirate flag in the Atlantic world, considerably better armed than most of the Royal Navy cruisers specifically tasked with hunting pirates like him. What Blackbeard did with that reputation once he had it is worth understanding on its own terms, because the popular image of him as an indiscriminately murderous monster sits awkwardly against the actual documented record of his captures. Surviving depositions from his victims describe a man who relied overwhelmingly on intimidation, rather than bloodshed, to take his prizes. A carefully cultivated appearance, including the practice, described in multiple contemporary accounts, of weaving slow-burning fuses into his thick black beard before battle, so that his own face appeared wreathed in smoke. An almost theatrical piece of psychological warfare that let him take ship after ship with minimal actual violence, because crews who believed they were facing a literal demon tended to surrender quickly rather than test that belief. This is the story of Blackbeard, in other words, as much as it is the story of any single ship or flag, a legend that a genuinely shrewd, calculating man built deliberately and then had to live inside for the rest of his short life, including on the final morning it finally failed to save him. That reputation reached its most dramatic public display in May of 1718, 5 months before Ocracoke, when Blackbeard blockaded the harbour of Charleston, South Carolina, with a flotilla of 4 vessels, stopping ships attempting to enter or leave the port, taking hostages including a prominent local official's son, and demanding a ransom paid not in coin, but specifically in medical supplies, a chest of medicine his own crew, suffering various illnesses common to shipboard life, badly needed. Charleston paid it. The blockade lifted, and Blackbeard sailed north along the coast with his reputation, if anything, larger than before. Not long after, in June of 1718, Queen Anne's Revenge ran hard aground and broke apart on a sandbar near Beaufort Inlet, North Carolina, an event historians still debate the full circumstances of, since Blackbeard deliberately marooned a portion of his own crew shortly afterward, and kept the greater share of accumulated plunder for a much smaller remaining company, leading some to suspect the grounding may have been less accidental than it first appeared, a convenient excuse to thin his own crew's claim on the treasure before he ever sought a pardon at all. Whatever the truth of that grounding, Blackbeard did seek and receive the king's pardon shortly afterward from Charles Eden, the governor of North Carolina, settling into a quieter existence in the small town of Bath, where he was, by several surviving colonial accounts, treated with a degree of local hospitality that raised real and lasting suspicion about Governor Eden's own complicity in Blackbeard's continued. Unofficial trading in stolen goods even after the pardon supposedly ended his piracy for good. Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, watching this arrangement from a neighbouring colony with no jurisdiction over North Carolina's waters at all, grew convinced that Blackbeard, pardoned or not, remained an active and intolerable threat to shipping along the whole coast, and by November of 1718 had decided to act regardless of the jurisdictional technicalities standing in his way. Hiring the two sloops Ranger and Jane, arming them with crews drawn partly from Hums Pearl and Hums Lime, and giving Lieutenant Robert Maynard clear direct instructions to hunt Blackbeard down at Ocracoke, where informants had confirmed he could reliably be found. Maynard's approach to the inlet on the evening of the 21st of November was cautious and deliberate rather than rushed, and it's worth pausing on that caution, because it tells us something important about how seriously a Royal Navy officer took the man he'd been sent to fight. Maynard anchored his sloops off the southern tip of Ocracoke Island as darkness fell, close enough to have found and engaged Blackbeard that same evening, and chose instead to wait through the night for morning and a more favourable tide, unwilling to risk navigating the inlet's genuinely treacherous shoals in darkness against a captain who almost certainly knew this water considerably better than he did. Aboard the Adventure, meanwhile, Blackbeard's own crew, reduced now to somewhere around 19 men, some contemporary accounts specifying 13 described as white and 6 described as black, a detail preserved in the surviving Admiralty report precisely because colonial authorities of this period tracked such distinctions carefully for their own administrative purposes, spent that same night in what one account describes as celebration, apparently unaware or unwilling to believe that the two unremarkable-looking sloops anchored nearby represented the most serious threat Blackbeard had faced in his entire career. Dawn brought the fight neither side had been able to avoid, as Maynard's sloops began working their way into the inlet. Both promptly ran aground on the very shoals Maynard had been cautious enough to fear the night before, a genuine tactical setback that briefly threatened to end the engagement before it properly began, until the rising tide and desperate effort from both crews worked the vessels free enough to continue closing the distance. Blackbeard, watching this unfold, ordered his own anchor cable cut and attempted to manoeuvre the Adventure in a way that would force his pursuers to follow him into water shallow enough to ground them permanently, a tactic identical in principle to the shoal-running evasion you already spent real time inside earlier tonight, aboard a very different ship, under a very different captain. It very nearly worked. But Maynard's crew managed to extricate the Jane in time to close the final distance, and as the two vessels came within hailing range, Blackbeard is reported to have shouted across the water, demanding to know who they were and what they wanted, and upon Maynard's reply that they carried the king's colours and were no pirates themselves to have answered. According to Maynard's own later account, the closest thing to a direct quotation this encounter has left us, that he would neither give nor take quarter from any man aboard. What followed was brutal, close, and mercifully brief. Blackbeard's crew fired a devastating opening volley into the Jane's crowded deck, killing or wounding a significant portion of Maynard's men in the first exchange alone. And for a moment the battle appeared to be tipping decisively toward the pirates. Maynard, according to the account he gave afterward, ordered his surviving men below decks out of sight, letting Blackbeard's crew believe the fight had already been won, and drawing them into a close boarding action they might otherwise have avoided, a tactical deception that, whether fully accurate in every detail or somewhat polished in the retelling, set up the final desperate hand-to-hand struggle that followed as Blackbeard himself led a boarding party across onto Maynard's own deck. It's worth noting, too, that among the men left aboard the Adventure during this final struggle was a crew member the surviving trial record identifies as Caesar, given standing orders, if the ship were about to be taken, to fire her powder magazine and destroy the vessel entirely rather than let her fall into Navy hands, an order that by the same record was only narrowly prevented from being carried out by another crew member who talked him out of it in the battle's final chaotic minutes. A detail that survives specifically because it came up directly in the subsequent Virginia trial of Blackbeard's captured crew, the same trials that decided, among other men, which of them walked free and which of them hanged. The hand-to-hand fighting that decided Blackbeard's own fate was, by every surviving account, ferocious and personal in a way most naval engagements of this era rarely were. Maynard and Blackbeard reportedly exchanged pistol fire and then closed with swords, and in the general melee that followed, Blackbeard sustained wounds from multiple opponents at once, later accounts, Drawing heavily on the same Charles Johnson history this whole story has already flagged as prone to dramatic embellishment, describe him absorbing something in the range of 20 sword cuts and 5 gunshot wounds before he finally fell. A tally striking enough that it's worth holding with the same appropriate scepticism this account has applied to other Johnson-derived details throughout. Tonight's journey, even as the basic fact of his death in that fighting is not seriously disputed by any source. Blackbeard died on the deck of the ship he'd boarded, and Maynard, in a final piece of grim, deliberate theatre, meant to prove beyond any doubt that the most feared pirate in the Atlantic was genuinely dead, ordered his head severed, and hung from the bowsprit of his own vessel for the voyage back up the coast to Virginia, a trophy that greeted cheering crowds and celebratory cannon fire when Maynard's ship finally reached the James River weeks later, the same kind of grim public proof that had already met Vane's gibbeted body at Port Royal, and would have met your own crew's fate too, had your own trial gone differently than it did. The surviving members of Blackbeard's crew were carried back to Virginia alongside their captain's severed head and put on trial there in the spring of 1719, the very same proceedings, following the very same pattern of mercy for the credibly forced and severity for the willing, that you already spent real time inside during the previous chapter of tonight's journey. Several were acquitted. Several more were hanged at what is now Hampton, Virginia, their bodies given the same public deterrent display that met condemned pirates from Nassau to Jamaica across this entire violent era. Lieutenant Maynard and his surviving crew, meanwhile, received their promised bounty money from the Virginia Assembly, though by several accounts considerably less generously and considerably more slowly than they'd been led to expect, a small, bureaucratic postscript to one of the era's most celebrated victories that rarely makes it into the more triumphant retellings. Blackbeard's story did not end with his death, not really, and the proof of that sits today in a stretch of shallow water not far from where his flagship first ran aground. In 1996, marine archaeologists located the wreck of what is now widely, though not with absolute certainty, identified as Queen Anne's Revenge herself, resting in roughly 20 feet of water near Beaufort Inlet, and the ongoing excavation of that site has recovered cannon, navigational instruments, medical tools, and thousands of smaller artifacts that have done more to reconstruct the genuine, unglamorized daily reality of a pirate ship's operation than any single written account from the period ever could. The political fallout from Spotswood's decision to send Maynard into another colony's waters, without any real legal authority to do so, rippled on for years after Blackbeard's head had stopped serving as a bowsprit trophy. Spotswood's actions technically violated North Carolina's own jurisdiction, and Governor Eden's allies in that colony were quick to point out the irregularity, framing Spotswood's raid as an overreach at best and, at worst, a deliberate attempt to embarrass a rival governor Spotswood had long suspected of profiting personally from his supposedly reformed neighbour's continued smuggling. The suspicion cut both ways, and was never fully resolved in either direction by any surviving court proceeding. Eden was never formally convicted of complicity in Blackbeard's post-pardon activities, but the accusation followed him for the remainder of his time in office, and the entire episode became one more small, unglamorous example of how colonial rivalry, personal ambition, and jurisdictional pettiness shaped the supposedly clean, heroic narrative of pirate hunting considerably more than popular memory tends to admit. Even the death of the most famous pirate in the Atlantic world, in other words, came wrapped in exactly the kind of bureaucratic infighting that never makes it into the songs. The detail preserved in the Admiralty's own report of Blackbeard's crew, 13 men recorded as white, 6 recorded as black, deserves a moment of direct, careful attention rather than a passing mention, because it points toward a genuinely undertold piece of this era's history. Pirate crews across the Golden Age, including Blackbeard's own, quite often included black sailors, some of them escaped or freed enslaved men, who had found, in a pirate ship's rough and often coerced form of solidarity, a degree of practical equality almost entirely unavailable to them anywhere else in the British Atlantic world of 1718, a share of plunder calculated the same way as any other crewman's, a vote in choosing a captain that colonial law would never have extended to them on land. And in at least some documented crews, positions of real authority and trust. This should not be romanticised into something it wasn't. Pirate crews also took and sold enslaved people as plunder in some documented instances, and the inclusion of black sailors reflected practical necessity and individual circumstance considerably more often than any coherent principle of equality. But the specific fact that 6 of Blackbeard's final 19 men were black, fighting and dying alongside their white shipmates in that inlet, sitting for a court's questioning afterward, under exactly the same forced or willing standard applied to everyone else, is a piece of the historical record worth stating plainly rather than leaving in the margins, because it complicates any simple story about who these crews actually were. It's worth giving Ocracoke Inlet itself a moment of attention too, because Blackbeard did not choose it by accident, and the reasons he favoured it echo directly against everything you already learned several chapters back about why shallow, poorly charted water mattered so much to a hunted pirate crew. The inlet's narrow, shifting channel, guarded by sandbars that moved with every significant storm, made it treacherous for any deep draft vessel unfamiliar with its current contours, exactly the kind of ground a resident pirate captain could use to his advantage against pursuers, exactly as your own captain had done, months earlier and considerably further south. In the waters around the Berry Islands. That the tactic ultimately failed Blackbeard, where it had succeeded for your own crew, came down to a difference of margins rather than a difference of strategy. Maynard's patient, overnight wait for a better tide gave him just enough advantage to survive his own sloop's grounding and press the fight regardless, where a less careful or less fortunate Navy officer might well have lost the whole engagement to the very shoals Blackbeard was counting on. Lieutenant Robert Maynard's own life after Ocracoke reads like a quiet, almost deliberate anticlimax set against the scale of what he'd accomplished, and it's worth closing this chapter with him rather than only with the pirate he killed. Despite delivering the Royal Navy one of its most celebrated victories of the entire anti-piracy campaign, Maynard's promised prize money arrived late and reduced. His career advanced only modestly in the years that followed, and he never again achieved anything close to the fame the Ocracoke battle briefly brought him. He is, in the end, a strange kind of footnote to his own most famous achievement, the man history remembers primarily as the person who killed Blackbeard, rather than as a figure with much of an independent story left to tell once that single bloody morning had passed. His own name far less recognisable today than the name of the pirate he spent one long, patient night waiting to destroy. There is something worth sitting with in that imbalance. The legend outgrew the man who killed it every bit as thoroughly as it had outgrown the man who first built it. What happened to Blackbeard's severed head after that triumphant, grisly homecoming has itself become a small nest of legend worth treating, with the same caution this whole account has applied to other colourful details from this era. Popular tradition holds that the skull was later fashioned into a drinking vessel by fraternity members at the College of William and Mary generations afterward, a story repeated often enough in regional lore that it has taken on a life of its own despite the thin, largely unverifiable evidence behind it, precisely the kind of embellished afterlife that tends to attach itself to famous remains once the person they belong to has passed fully from history into legend. What can be said with more confidence is simpler and considerably less dramatic. The head served its intended purpose as proof of death and public deterrent within days of the battle, and whatever became of it afterward, the man it had belonged to was, by that point, already well on his way to becoming more story than fact. This is the story of Blackbeard, then, the legend a shrewd, image-conscious man built out of smoke and reputation, the fear he wielded with remarkably little actual bloodshed for most of his career, and the single brutal morning in a shallow inlet, where that legend finally had to be paid for in full, with his own life at the hands of 57 tired sailors who had waited through one long, deliberate night before they were finally willing to collect the debt. Somewhere back at the very start of tonight's journey, you were lying in a hammock that smelled of tar and bilge water, listening to a rat cross a deck beam with total confidence, in the last quiet minutes before a lookout's voice changed everything. It's worth returning there now, one last time. That ship, made it through its night. Josiah Barlow made it through his trial on the strength of two frightened men who chose, at real cost to themselves, to tell the truth about him. Thomas Pruitt's crushed fingers were entered against a ship's articles that no merchant captain of the era would ever have troubled himself to write down at all. Peter Coyle did not make it, and neither did Charles Vane, in the end, nor Blackbeard, whose entire fearsome legend bought him considerably less time than the quiet, forced men who never wanted any part of that legend in the first place. None of that is a tidy ending. History rarely offers one. What it offers instead, if you let it, is something closer to company. Somewhere in these same waters, 300 years before you ever climbed into your own bed tonight, a frightened man lay in the dark listening for footsteps overhead, wondering whether tomorrow would be the day his luck finally ran out. He didn't know how his story ended any more than you know how yours will. He just had to lie there, in the heat and the crowding and the smell of tar, and wait for morning the way you're about to wait for sleep, one slow breath at a time, trusting that the dark wouldn't ask more of him tonight than he could survive. You're warm right now. You're dry. Nobody is counting the guns on your roof. That gap between his night and yours is the whole quiet gift of history. Not that it happened to him instead of you, but that it happened at all, and that someone, 3 centuries later, still cares enough to tell it slowly, in the dark, until you fall asleep. You're warm. You're safe. Tonight, that's enough.